You will never be my equal." Her new husband turned to face the room, raised his glass and said it loud enough for every guest in Bradford Hall to hear. He was smiling when he said it. The candles were burning. The room was full of people who laughed. And Emily Winthrop, 26 years old, calm as still water, simply set down her champagne glass and looked directly into his eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She didn't give him the satisfaction of a single trembling breath, because she already knew something Thomas Bradford did not. The most dangerous woman in any room is the one men are too arrogant to watch. If you have ever been dismissed by someone who should have known better, stay with me. This story was written for you. Subscribe and let's begin. England, the West Riding of Yorkshire, February 1816. The winter had come in hard and cold that year, the kind that pushed frost through stone walls and made even the finest estates feel hollow. But inside Bradford Hall, no one was thinking about the cold. Bradford Hall was the most celebrated estate in 3 counties. Its ballroom alone could swallow a smaller man's entire ambition. The chandeliers held 400 candles each, and tonight every single one of them was burning hot and golden and proud, just like the man who owned them. Thomas Bradford stood at the head of the room in a coat that had been made for him in London, with boots that had been polished by a servant that morning until they threw back the candlelight like mirrors. He was 35 years old. He was built like a man who had never once been told no. His jaw was the kind of jaw that appeared in oil portraits. His shoulders filled out a room the same way his name filled out a conversation, completely with no space left for anyone else. He was by every measure that mattered in England in 1816, magnificent. And he knew it. Every man in that ballroom knew it too, which was why they laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, and filled their glasses when he filled his, and nodded when he spoke, as though he were delivering scripture from a pulpit made of mahogany and ancestral pride. The women knew it differently. The way women always know things differently, with a quiet wariness that didn't show on their faces, because showing things on your face in 1816 was not considered ladylike. And then there was Emily Winthrop. She stood beside him at the altar, now beside him in the ballroom, in a gown of ivory silk with Yorkshire lace at the collar that her mother had worn at her own wedding 30 years before. Emily had insisted on the lace, not because it was fashionable, because it was her mother's, and Emily Winthrop had always understood the difference between what was fashionable and what was real. She was 26. She was the daughter of a respected but modest family scholars, her people readers, thinkers, the kind of family that had more books than silver, and considered that a reasonable trade. Her father had taught her Latin before she was 10. Her mother had taught her household accounts before she was 12. By 16, Emily could read a ledger the way other women read novels, not just for the story on the surface, but for the story hidden underneath in the numbers that didn't quite add up in the columns that shifted when no one was looking. She was not the most beautiful woman in the room. She was something more unsettling than beautiful. She was precise. Thomas had chosen her after a careful consideration that he would have described as romantic, and that Emily understood was essentially practical. He needed a wife from a respectable family. He needed someone educated enough to run a household intelligently, because his mother was aging and his previous housekeeper had proven catastrophically dishonest. He needed someone who would not embarrass him in company. He did not need and had not particularly wanted a partner. The difference between those two things, between a wife and a partner, was the entire story of what was about to happen. Richard Whitmore raised his glass first. He was 55, red-faced, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who wore his wealth like armor, heavy and obvious, and designed to keep other people at a respectful distance. He was Thomas's oldest business associate. He had contracts with Bradford Estate that stretched back 15 years. He smiled with all his teeth, which was one more than most men used. "To Mr. Bradford," Richard announced, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the ease of a man who had made many toasts and enjoyed every single one of them. "And to his most remarkable achievement." The room laughed. Glasses rose. Someone near the back called out, "Hear, hear," and the sound bounced cheerfully off the marble floors and the gilded ceiling and all 400 candles. Thomas smiled. He accepted the praise the way a man accepts something he considers his natural due, pleasantly without surprise. Then he turned to Emily. Something crossed his face in that moment. It was not cruelty exactly. It was something more dangerous than cruelty, because cruelty at least knows what it is. What crossed Thomas Bradford's face was the casual, comfortable confidence of a man who has never once had to question his own superiority. "Although I must admit," he said, lifting his own glass and speaking loud enough for the nearest 20 guests to hear without quite addressing them, "I never expected such a sensible woman would accept a man like me." More laughter. Warmer this time, with that specific quality that belongs to humor that flatters the man making the joke. Emily did not laugh. She held her glass and watched him with those steady dark eyes of hers and said nothing. Thomas turned toward her more fully. He was performing now in the way powerful men perform when they have an audience they trust to agree with them. "You must understand something, Emily." His voice had shifted. Still pleasant. Still the voice of a man at his own wedding reception among friends in his own home. But underneath the pleasantness was something else. A firmness. A statement of fact. "You are my wife." He paused. "But you will never be my equal." The room didn't go silent all at once. It went silent in a wave, the nearest guests first, then spreading outward as those further away noticed the change in air, the way you notice weather changing before you understand quite what the change means. Someone near the window stopped mid-sentence. Someone else set down their glass. A woman in blue silk near the fireplace pressed her lips together and looked at the floor. Everyone waited. For tears. For the trembling lip, the stiffening spine, the polite and feminine retreat that the situation seemed to call for. They waited for Emily to look away, or down, or to produce the social smile that women in 1816 kept ready at all times for precisely these occasions. Emily did none of those things. She set her champagne glass down on the table beside her. Slowly, without rattling it. She straightened, not dramatically, not in the way of a woman making a scene, but in the way of a woman who has simply decided to take up the space she is entitled to. And she looked directly into his eyes. "Then I hope, Mr. Bradford," she said, "that one day you come to understand what an equal truly is." Her voice was not raised. It was not trembling. It was the voice of a woman stating a fact to a man she is not entirely sure is capable of comprehending it yet, but who she remains despite everything willing to give the chance. Thomas smiled. The smile of a man who has heard what he expected to hear and found it satisfying. He thought he had won. He raised his glass again to the room, and the moment passed, and the music started up again, and the guests recovered themselves and returned to their conversations with the faint collective relief of people who have witnessed something uncomfortable and been spared the full consequences of it. But Emily did not look away from him immediately. She held his gaze for one breath longer than was strictly comfortable. Then she picked up her champagne glass, turned to the woman beside her, the wife of a local magistrate, a quiet, sensible woman named Mrs. Alderton, and asked with genuine interest about her daughter's recent recovery from illness. Mrs. Alderton blinked, then answered, then slowly relaxed. Because that was the thing about Emily Winthrop Bradford. She made people feel seen, not performed at, not managed. Actually seen with the particular attention of someone who genuinely found other people interesting and treated that interest as one of the great pleasures of being alive. Thomas watched her from across the room later that evening and felt for the first time something that he could not quite name. It was not admiration. He would not have allowed himself admiration for a woman he had just publicly put in her place. It was something more uncomfortable than admiration. It was curiosity. The carriages began leaving Bradford Hall near midnight. Richard Whitmore was among the last. He clasped Thomas's hand at the door with that broad, warm grip of his, the grip of a man who has spent 30 years making other men feel secure in his presence, and he said quietly near Thomas's ear, "Sensible girl. Good choice, Bradford. Won't cause you any trouble." "No," Thomas agreed. "She won't." He believed that absolutely. He was in ways he could not yet measure absolutely wrong. Time. The servants had prepared the east wing for Emily. Her rooms, her sitting room, her small private study which Thomas had assigned to her with the mild benevolence of a man granting a gift he considers generous. He had not asked what she needed it for. He had assumed she would use it for correspondence and perhaps needlework. Emily thanked him for it with the composure she brought to everything, and that night, after the last of the wedding guests had gone, and the hall had settled into its cold, creaking quiet, she sat at the writing desk in her new study and opened the small leather journal she had brought from her father's house. She wrote 3 lines. "The estate accounts are kept in the East Library. I have not seen them yet. The head steward, Mr. Fallow, has the look of a man who has forgotten something important. The merchant Whitmore watches Thomas the way a man watches a door he has a key to." She closed the journal. She looked at the candle. She was not afraid. She was not angry, not yet, not in the burning way. What she felt was something more patient than anger. Something that had no clean name in English in 1816, though in later years it might have been called focus. She had come into this house as a wife. She intended to understand it the way she understood everything completely, from the foundations, up number by number, fact by fact, until the picture emerged and she could see exactly what it showed. The morning after the wedding. Bradford Estate woke at 5 o'clock, the way working estates always did, regardless of what celebrations had happened the night before. Fires needed laying. Animals needed feeding. The business of a great English landholding did not pause for sentiment. Emily woke at 5:15. She dressed without her maid. She had always preferred it, found the silence useful for thinking, and by 6 she was in the kitchen asking the cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Higgins, who had been with the Bradford family for 22 years, if she might have a cup of tea and a look at the household ledgers. Mrs. Higgins stared at her, not unkindly. With the specific caution of a woman who has worked for powerful families long enough to know that the arrival of a new mistress is always a disruption, and that disruptions were best navigated carefully. "The household ledgers, ma'am." "If you don't mind." Emily accepted her tea and smiled. "I find it easier to manage a household when I understand it from the beginning, rather than learning it piece by piece. Less chance of unpleasant surprises for everyone." Mrs. Higgins considered this for a long moment. Then she produced the ledgers. Emily sat at the kitchen table, not in any formal room, not making any production of it, and opened the first book. She read for 2 hours. When she finished, she closed the book carefully, thanked Mrs. Higgins for the tea, and went to find Thomas. Howe was in his study, which occupied the largest room in the south wing, and smelled of leather and wood smoke, and a particular kind of male authority that had been accumulating in that room for 3 generations of Bradford men. Thomas was reviewing correspondence. He had a glass of something amber at his elbow, even at this hour, which he did not consider a habit, only a preference. Emily knocked, entered when he called, sat in the chair across from his desk when he gestured to it without waiting to be told twice. "There are irregularities in the household accounts," she said, not as an accusation, as a fact being presented to the person most capable of acting on it. Thomas looked up from his correspondence. He had the expression of a man who has been told something he was not expecting to be told, and is deciding how to feel about it. "I beg your pardon. The food costs for the estate have increased by 30% over the past 18 months. Emily continued. "But the number of staff has not increased, and there have been no major events until last night's wedding. The coal accounts show a similar pattern, and the wage records for the field workers have entries in 2 different handwritings in the same columns." Thomas set down his correspondence. "Emily, I'm not suggesting malice necessarily," she said, "though I'm not ruling it out. It could be simple incompetence. It could be that Mr. Fallow has been approving orders without checking them carefully. But it needs to be examined, Thomas. These numbers." "Emily." His voice had not raised. It had done something quieter, and in some ways more effective. It had settled the way a heavy stone settles. "This estate has been managed by experienced men for 3 decades. I know. You have been here for 1 morning. I know that too." She held his gaze. "But numbers don't change based on how long you've been in a room, Thomas. They show what they show." He looked at her for a long moment. "I appreciate your enthusiasm," he said, and the word enthusiasm carried in it a world of gentle, condescending dismissal. the same way you might compliment a child on their drawing without suggesting you intend to hang it. But I have men who handle these matters, experienced men, men who have managed this estate's finances for years. I understand. Emily stood. She had learned in her father's house that there was a time to press an argument and a time to let it rest. She could see Thomas's jaw, the set of it the way it told her that pressing now would only make him less likely to hear her later. I only ask that you look at the records yourself when you have a moment. I will. He had already picked up his correspondence again. Thank you for your diligence, Emily. She walked to the door. One other thing, she said, pausing with her hand on the frame. He looked up. Mr. Whitmore was here very early this morning, speaking with Mr. Fallow at the east gate. I saw them from my study window. A pause the length of a breath, not longer. I thought you might want to know. She left before he could respond. Thomas Bradford did not look at the records that week. He was busy. There were tenant matters to attend to, correspondence from London, a dispute about a property boundary on the northern edge of the estate that required his personal attention. These were real things. These were the kinds of things that filled the days of men who owned large estates, and Thomas was not a lazy man. He worked hard. He simply worked hard on the things he understood and trusted to other men, the things he considered beneath his direct attention. The household accounts fell into that second category. Emily understood this. She did not push. She did not mention the ledgers again for 3 weeks. Instead, she learned the estate. She walked it. Every morning early before the household had fully woken, she pulled on her good boots and her heaviest cloak, and she walked. She knew the fields by the 3rd day. She knew the stables by the 4th. She knew the names of the field hands, not because she had asked for a list, but because she had introduced herself to each of them individually, which was something that had never happened to them in living memory. A woman named Nell, who managed the dairy, told her later that the field workers had spent a full evening after Emily's first visit, debating whether something was wrong with the new mistress, or whether she was simply peculiar. They had decided by a narrow margin that peculiar was not necessarily a problem. Emily also spent time in the library, the East Library, the one with the estate records going back 60 years, the one that smelled of old paper and damp and undisturbed history. She read systematically. Not just the recent ledgers, the old ones too. She was building a picture of how Bradford Estate had operated across time, which costs had been stable, and which had moved, which contracts had been maintained, and which had been replaced, and when. On the 14th of March, 1816, 3 weeks after her wedding, Emily found the first contract signed by Richard Whitmore. She read it twice. Then she read the contract it had replaced. Then she went back to the ledgers and found the payment records that corresponded to both contracts. She sat for a long time in the cold East Library, with the records spread across the table, and the candle burning lower and lower, and the shape of something ugly, emerging from the columns of numbers, the way a face emerges from fog slowly, then all at once. She did not go to Thomas that evening. She needed more. She needed enough that he could not dismiss it. She needed a structure of evidence so clear and so complete that even a man who did not want to see it would find it impossible to look away. She needed, in other words, to be not just right, but undeniable. Because she already understood something that would take Thomas Bradford much longer to learn. When a woman in 1816 told a powerful man he was wrong, she could not afford to be approximately right. She had to be absolutely right, and she had to be able to prove it. She picked up her pen. She opened a clean page of her journal, and she began to write down everything she knew. At dinner that evening, Thomas mentioned that Richard Whitmore had suggested expanding their commercial partnership. New contracts, more territory, greater investment. He's been a tremendous asset, Thomas said, serving himself from the joint of mutton. 20 years we've worked together. I trust him as I'd trust my own brother. Emily looked at her plate. What do you know of his other partnerships? She asked. Careful, conversational, the tone of a woman making dinner talk. Thomas shrugged with one shoulder. He's well established. Multiple arrangements across Yorkshire and into Derbyshire. Good family, good reputation. Have you seen his books? Thomas paused in his serving. Emily. I'm curious, that's all. She met his eyes with perfect composure. Business curiosity, a trait I may have inherited from my father. A beat of silence. Thomas's expression was one she was coming to recognize the tension between his genuine respect for her intelligence and his discomfort at the direction it kept pointing. I have not seen his books, Thomas said finally. Nor would it be appropriate to ask for them. That is not how trust works. Emily nodded slowly. I see. She returned her attention to her dinner. You're right, of course. She said nothing else on the subject that evening. But that night, she wrote 4 more pages in her journal, and the picture on those pages was growing clearer by the hour. By the end of April, Emily had enough. Not just suspicion, not just irregularities that might have innocent explanations. Evidence. Real documented traceable evidence, the kind that told a story. Even a man who refused to read it would eventually find himself standing inside. Richard Whitmore had been for at least 4 years systematically manipulating Bradford's commercial contracts. He had altered agreements after they were signed, not dramatically, not in ways that would catch the casual eye, but precisely surgically in the small clauses that governed payment timing and supply quantities and penalty structures. He had arranged for Bradford's suppliers to be overcharged with the excess flowing through 2 intermediary accounts into a third account that had no name attached to it that matched any legitimate Bradford creditor. He had used Thomas's name and Thomas's reputation and Thomas's absolute bedrock brotherly trust as the vehicle for his own enrichment. Year after year, payment after payment, with the confidence of a man who knows that the person whose name he is trading on will never look closely enough to notice. Because Thomas Bradford was a proud man. And proud men do not examine the foundations of what they stand on. Emily gathered everything: the contracts, the corresponding ledger entries, the payment records, the discrepancies, the pattern of the alterations, and what they consistently produced, and she organized it with the clarity and precision of a woman who had grown up in a house where clear thinking was the highest form of respect. Then she went to find her husband. You need to look at something, she told him. She had waited until evening when the day's business was done, and Thomas was in his study with his amber drink and his correspondence, and the settled air of a man who has survived another full day of being Thomas Bradford. She had timed it carefully. She had learned already that timing mattered enormously when the goal was to be heard. He looked up. I've been looking at the Whitmore contracts. She set the folder on his desk. All of them. Going back 4 years. Thomas's hand went still on his glass. Emily, I know you don't want to hear this. Her voice was steady, not pleading, not apologetic. Steady in the way of a woman who is carrying something heavy and intends to set it down properly. I know you trust Richard. I know the idea of this is... She paused, chose the word deliberately, uncomfortable. But Thomas, the numbers are here. Every alteration, every redirected payment, every discrepancy traced back to its source. He did not open the folder. He looked at her instead, and something moved across his face that she could not quite read. It wasn't anger, though she had braced for anger. It wasn't dismissal, though she had seen enough of that to recognize it at 30 paces. It was something rawer than either of those things. You've been investigating my business, he said. I've been protecting your estate, Emily answered. The way I have been since the morning after our wedding, when you didn't want to hear it then either. Silence. A long silence. The candle on his desk sputtered. Thomas looked at the folder. His hand moved to it, stopped. Then, with the slow, reluctant deliberateness of a man moving toward something he already suspects will hurt him, he opened it. He read. Emily sat across from him and waited, and did not speak because there was nothing left to say, and she understood that perfectly. The document said everything. She had made sure of it. Every column, every discrepancy, every traced payment. It was all there in a handwriting so clear and a structure so logical that even a man who desperately wanted to find an alternative explanation would fail to locate one. She watched his face change. First resistance. The slight tightening around the eyes that meant there must be another explanation. Then recognition. The moment the pattern became undeniable. Then something she had not expected, which was grief. Thomas Bradford's face when he finally understood what Richard Whitmore had done to him did not look like the face of a proud man confronting a threat. It looked like the face of a man who has just discovered that something he loved was never what he believed it to be. He closed the folder. He sat for a long time. "How long?" His voice was different, quieter. "How long have you known?" "I've been gathering evidence for 6 weeks," Emily said. "I brought you my first concerns in February. The morning after their wedding." He remembered. He had picked up his correspondence again before she had finished walking out the door. He didn't say anything. Thomas. Emily leaned forward slightly, not reaching for him, just closing the distance between them by a few degrees. "This can be corrected. The estate is salvageable. The contracts can be renegotiated, the losses documented, and potentially recovered through proper legal channels. This is not the end of Bradford Hall. It is the beginning of running it more carefully." He looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" It was such an unexpected question that she blinked. "Because it is true," she said. "And because it is your estate, and I live in it, and I am your wife, even if you have not always remembered what that means." Something shifted in Thomas Bradford's expression, then something that did not resolve itself into any clean emotion, but sat there complex and unfinished, like a sum that has not yet been carried to its conclusion. He nodded once. "Thank you, Emily," he said. She stood. She walked to the door. And it was only when her hand was on the handle that he spoke again quietly to her back. "I should have listened in February." She paused. "Yes," she said. "You should have." And she opened the door and walked out. She never raised her voice. She never begged. She never needed anyone's permission to know what she knew. The question was never whether Emily Bradford was his equal. The question was whether Thomas Bradford was capable of becoming worthy of standing beside her. That answer, and the war that came before it, is where this story truly begins. If you are still here, you already know what kind of woman Emily was. You recognize her. Maybe you've been her. Stay with us. Because the fight is just getting started, and Emily Winthrop Bradford is only getting stronger. Subscribe if this story speaks to you. You are exactly who it was written for. The morning after Thomas read the documents, he did not come to breakfast. Emily sat alone at the long dining table with her tea and her toast, and the particular silence of a house that is holding its breath. She did not send for him. She did not ask the footman where he was. She ate her breakfast, read 3 pages of the correspondence she had been working through, and waited with the patience of a woman who has learned that some things must be allowed to find their own shape before they can be handled. It was Mrs. Higgins who told her in the careful way of a servant who has learned to deliver information without appearing to carry it, that Mr. Bradford had called for his horse at 5 in the morning and ridden out without a word to anyone about where he was going or when he intended to return. Emily thanked her and asked for more tea. Thomas came back at noon. His boots were muddy. His face had the particular quality of a man who has ridden hard in the cold for several hours and emerged from it, not refreshed, but emptied, which is sometimes the same thing as ready. He walked past the dining room without stopping, past the study, past the east corridor that led to the library, where Emily had spent the past 6 weeks building the case that had just dismantled his most trusted friendship. He stopped at the door of her sitting room. She was at her desk. She heard his footstep, had heard it since the moment he entered the house, had been waiting for it. The way you wait for weather. You can feel but cannot yet see, and she set down her pen without turning around. "Come in," she said. He came in. He stood in the middle of the room with his riding coat still on and mud still on his boots, and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not in their brief courtship, not on their wedding day, not in any of the weeks of careful, managed, largely distant cohabitation that had constituted their marriage thus far. He looked for the first time in her experience of him uncertain. "I went to see Whitmore," he said. Emily turned in her chair. "You went to see him?" She kept her voice level. "Alone, this morning, without speaking to me first." "He's my associate, my—" Thomas stopped. The word friend seemed to catch somewhere in his throat. I needed to hear it from him directly. And what did he say? Thomas pulled out the chair across from her desk. The one guests used the smaller chair, which was almost funny given the size of him and the smallness of the chair, and sat down in it with the controlled heaviness of a man who is very tired. He denied it, Thomas said. All of it, completely. Told me the documents must have been misread. Told me figures like these required professional interpretation, He stopped again. That a what? Emily asked, though she already knew. That a woman without formal financial training could easily misinterpret. Thomas's jaw was set. Not against her. She could see that set against the words themselves, against the sound of them coming out of his own mouth, in the light of what he had read last night. That is what he said. The room was quiet for a moment. And you? Emily asked. What did you tell him? Thomas looked at her across the desk, and something passed between them. Not warmth, yet not trust, but the beginning of something that might become either of those things, if it was handled with sufficient care. I told him I would be reviewing all contracts personally. He paused. And I told him that my wife had a great deal more financial training than he appeared to have taken into account. Emily held his gaze. That was the right thing to say, she told him. He nodded once stiffly, the nod of a man who is not accustomed to needing to be told when he has done something right, and finds the experience uncomfortable and also possibly necessary. Then he stood up, straightened his coat, and walked to the door. I'll need your help, he said from the doorway with his back still to her. Understanding the rest of what you found, all of it. I know, Emily said. I'll be ready when you are. He left without another word. Emily looked at the door for a long moment after he had gone. Then she turned back to her desk and wrote 2 words in her journal. It begins. It began. For the next 3 weeks, Thomas Bradford sat across from his wife every evening after dinner, and Emily Winthrop Bradford walked him through the evidence she had assembled with the methodical, unsentimental clarity of a woman who had spent 6 weeks making sure there was no room for doubt. She showed him contract by contract, alteration by alteration. She traced each payment from the Bradford accounts through the intermediaries that Whitmore had constructed, some of them so cleverly designed that even now, looking directly at them, Thomas had to look twice before he could see the seam where the legitimate business ended and the theft began. Thomas was not a stupid man. That was something Emily had understood about him from early in their acquaintance, even when he was using his intelligence primarily to justify his own prejudices. He was sharp when he chose to engage, and he engaged now with the focused intensity of someone who has discovered that the ground beneath him is less solid than he believed, and is furiously cataloging exactly how the damage was done so that he might prevent it from spreading. He asked good questions. He connected details she had not yet connected. He found 2 additional discrepancies in contracts she had not yet reviewed. He did not thank her for any of this. But he stopped interrupting her. That was Emily decided sufficient for the moment. It was on a Wednesday evening in early May, when they had been working through the 3rd consecutive night of contract reviews, that Thomas leaned back in his chair and pressed his hands over his face and said with a muffled exhaustion that was the most genuinely unguarded thing she had heard from him. He's been doing this for 4 years, at minimum, Emily confirmed. The records before that point have certain inconsistencies I haven't been able to trace fully, but the pattern I can document with certainty begins in 1812. Thomas lowered his hands. He stared at the ceiling of the study, his father's study, the room where his father had made decisions for 30 years before him, where portraits of Bradford men going back a century hung in frames that had never once been questioned. My father trusted him, Thomas said, quietly, to the ceiling as much as to her. I trusted him because my father trusted him. The same way I trust everything my father built. The way you trust things, when they've been part of your life so long, you stop being able to see them as things that could fail. Emily looked at him. This was new territory. Thomas Bradford did not speak about feeling things. He spoke about doing things, about having things, about what things meant in terms of position and power, and the organized structure of his world. She was not sure she had ever heard him speak about trust in this way, as something vulnerable, something that could be exploited, something that had been exploited, and she understood that she was seeing something that required careful handling. "The failure was his," she said. "Not your father's, not yours." Thomas looked at her. "I gave him the access," Thomas said. "I gave him my name and my accounts and my complete absence of scrutiny, and he used all of it. Because he is a man of exceptional cunning and no conscience," Emily said. And there was a precision in her voice that cut cleanly through the self-reproach. "You trusted a man who had spent 20 years making himself trustworthy to you. That is not stupidity, Thomas. That is how he wanted you to be. He needed you exactly as you were." Something changed in Thomas's expression. Not relief, nothing so complete as that. But something eased slightly, the way a muscle eases when it has been held rigid for too long. Then he looked back at the documents. "What do we do now?" he asked. And for the first time since her wedding night, Emily felt something that was not patience or focus or quiet, determined competence. She felt something warmer than those things. She felt useful. "Now," she said, "we build a case that no solicitor in England can dismiss, and then we take it to one." Richard Whitmore came to Bradford Hall on a Thursday. He had not been invited. Emily was in the East Library when the footman knocked to say that Mr. Whitmore had arrived and was asking to see Mr. Bradford on a matter of some urgency. She closed her books, straightened her dress, and went to find Thomas before Whitmore found him first. She caught Thomas in the corridor outside his study, just as he was moving toward the front of the house, and she put one hand briefly on his arm. She rarely touched him, and the touch stopped him as effectively as a shout. "Let me be there," she said. "Emily." Not to speak, to listen. Her eyes were very direct. "He is here because he is afraid, which means he is going to try something. I want to watch what he tries." Thomas looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at her face. And then he made a decision that in all the months of his marriage so far, he had never once made in this form. He stepped to the side and gestured for her to walk with him. Whitmore was in the front parlor. He was standing too agitated to sit. Emily noted immediately, and he had his hat in both hands, which was the tell of a man who needed something to do with his hands. His color was high. He had the look of someone who had not slept well. Good, Emily thought. "Thomas." Whitmore's voice went immediately to warmth, to the practiced, easy warmth of a man who has used his charm as a business instrument for 30 years. He stepped forward with his hand extended. Then he saw Emily, and the warmth flickered and recovered itself so quickly that only someone watching very carefully would have noticed the gap. "And Mrs. Bradford?" He inclined his head. "A pleasure. Mr. Whitmore." Emily returned the inclination with perfect composure. She moved to stand slightly to the side and behind Thomas, not retreating, not deferring, but positioning herself where she could see Whitmore's face while he focused his attention on Thomas. "I'll come to the point," Whitmore said. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I've been thinking, Thomas, about the questions you raised when you came to see me, and I believe I know where the confusion originated." He held out the paper. Thomas took it. "Read it." His face told Emily nothing, which meant he was keeping it carefully controlled, which meant whatever was on that paper had surprised him. "What is this?" Thomas asked. "A statement from my accountant," Whitmore said, "explaining the payment structures in question, the discrepancies that were identified." The hesitation before that were identified was nearly invisible, but Emily caught it. "They're the result of a renegotiation I conducted in 1814, entirely within the terms of our agreements, which my accountant has now documented in full. I should have provided this clarity earlier. I apologize for any confusion." Silence. Emily watched Whitmore's hands tighten slightly on the brim of his hat, then release. "May I?" she asked. Both men looked at her. She held out her hand toward Thomas, and after a fraction of a second, he gave her the paper. She read it. She read it slowly, with the particular stillness of someone parsing each sentence, not for its surface meaning, but for the structure underneath. The accountant's statement was confident. It was detailed. It was, if you read it at the pace and with the trust that Whitmore had designed it to be read, quite convincing. It was also she identified in approximately 90 seconds, constructed around 2 documents that she knew for a fact did not exist in the Bradford records. This references a supplementary agreement dated March 1814, Emily said. She did not look up from the paper immediately. An addendum to the primary supply contract signed by both parties, which authorized the revised payment structure. Now she looked up, directly at Whitmore. I've reviewed every document in the Bradford contract files going back to 1810. There is no supplementary agreement dated March 1814. Whitmore smiled. The smile of a man who has had 30 years to perfect the art of smiling in uncomfortable situations. Perhaps it was misfiled, he said. These things happen. I can certainly produce my copy. You had a copy made, Emily said. Not a question. The smile stayed exactly where it was. But his eyes changed. Something moved behind them fast, controlled the movement of a man making rapid calculations behind a steady face. Mrs. Bradford, he said, and his voice had shifted just slightly, adding the particular gravity a man uses when he is about to make a woman feel that she has overstepped. I appreciate your interest in household matters, but these are complex commercial arrangements that have developed over many years, and I would hate for anyone to draw conclusions from an incomplete understanding of. My wife's understanding, Thomas said, is not incomplete. The words were quiet. They were also, Emily understood from the way Whitmore's expression moved, completely unexpected. Thomas stepped forward. Not threateningly, but forward in the way of a man claiming space he has decided belongs to him. She has reviewed every contract, every ledger entry, and every payment record associated with our arrangement going back 4 years, Thomas continued. She has produced documentation of 47 specific discrepancies, each traced to its source with a clarity that I have reviewed personally and found irrefutable. A pause. There is no misfiled agreement, Richard. The parlor was very quiet. Whitmore looked between them. Emily watched him assess the situation, watched him recognize with the sharp accuracy of a man who survives on reading rooms that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic he had relied on. The wife was not a manageable inconvenience. The husband was not going to be separated from her perspective. The ground he had built his confidence on was no longer where he had left it. Thomas, he said, and now his voice had dropped to something more private, more direct, the voice of a man calling in a debt he is not sure still exists. We have known each other for 20 years. Your father trusted me. I have been a part of this family's business for. I know what you have been, Thomas said. I know exactly what you have been. I read the documents. Silence. Whitmore's hat was very still in his hands now. I think, Thomas said, that you should leave. And I think you should expect to hear from my solicitor before the end of the month. Whitmore left. He did not move quickly. He was too controlled for that. He walked at a deliberate pace and put on his hat at the door and did not look back. But his color when he turned was no longer high. It was gray. Emily waited until the sound of his carriage had fully receded from the front drive before she said anything. He's going to move quickly now, she said. Whatever he can obscure, whatever documents he can reclaim or alter or destroy, he'll begin today. Thomas turned to look at her. I know. He had that empty, ridden hard quality again, not from writing this time, but from a different kind of effort. The effort of seeing someone clearly that you have loved. What do we do? We've already made copies of everything material. Emily moved toward the corridor, toward the East Library, toward the work. I began duplicating the key records 3 weeks ago and sent them to my father's house in Yorkshire for safekeeping. Thomas stopped walking. You. He turned. 3 weeks ago. Before I brought the full evidence to you, she confirmed. Before I knew whether you would believe me or dismiss me. Before I knew what you would do with the information. He stared at her. You didn't trust me, he said. Not with anger. With something that was possibly worse than anger. Something that was almost wonder. I trusted you to be the man you had shown me you were, Emily said. I hoped that man was not all you were capable of being, but I planned for the possibility that he was. She held his gaze without apology. I protected your estate, Thomas. That is what I came here to do. He was silent for a long moment. Then, very quietly, Did you always know that you would have to do it this way? I thought it was likely, Emily said. Based on the first morning when I brought you the household accounts, and you set down your glass and told me your estate had been managed by experienced men for 3 decades. Something moved across Thomas Bradford's face. Complex and layered the way feeling is always layered in people who have spent years compressing it into manageable shapes. I owe you an apology, he said, for that morning. You owe me several, Emily said, but you can start there. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Emily's marriage. Not harder than what had come before. Harder would have been easier in a way, because hard things have clear edges and you know exactly where to push. These weeks were strange because something was changing in Bradford Hall that had no name and no precedent and kept shifting shape just when she thought she understood what it was. Thomas was present for the first time in a way he had not been. He came to her study. He knocked before he entered. He sat in the small chair across her desk and asked questions that were genuinely curious rather than pointed questions that wanted her answers rather than her agreement with his conclusions. He started reading the ledgers himself, not to check her work she understood, but because he was trying to learn what she already knew, trying to close a gap between them that he was only now beginning to measure. The solicitor came. Mr. Pierce was a dry, careful man from Leeds who wore his competence as quietly as his coats, and who spent 4 hours in the East Library with Emily and Thomas, reviewing the evidence, asking his precise questions, writing his careful notes. At the end of those 4 hours, he looked up from his notes and told Thomas with the unvarnished directness of a professional man that the case was substantial. The documentation was exceptional, and whoever had assembled it had done work he would not have expected from a trained clerk, let alone. He stopped himself. He glanced at Emily, who was sitting across the table with her hands folded and her expression entirely composed. You assembled this documentation, Mrs. Bradford. I did. Mr. Pierce looked at his notes, then at Emily, then at Thomas, then back at his notes with the careful non-expression of a man who has just revised his understanding of a situation and is not going to make a production of it. Exceptional work, he said. Thank you, Emily said. Thomas said nothing. But when Emily glanced at him, she found him watching her with an expression she could not immediately decode, something she had never seen on his face in all their months together. It was not the managed performing confidence he carried into every room like a piece of furniture. It was not the guarded assessment he used when he did not trust a situation. It was something undefended. She looked away before either of them had to decide what to do with it. The talk had already begun. Emily heard it first from Mrs. Alderton, who came to call on a Tuesday in late May with the particular brightness of a woman delivering information she considers important. They sat in the front parlor with their tea, and Mrs. Alderton arranged her cup with the careful attention that preceded significant conversation. People are talking about Whitmore, she said. Nothing specific. You know how it is, a word here, a question there. But the atmosphere at the Harley dinner last week was quite different. Men who have dealt with him professionally are starting to ask questions I've never heard them ask before. Emily listened and said very little, which was one of her considerable skills. And people are talking about you, Mrs. Alderton added in a different tone. Not gossip. Something more careful than gossip. Emily set down her cup. What are they saying? That you are formidably clever. A pause. Some of them mean it admiringly. And the others? Mrs. Alderton met her eyes with the direct, unflinching honesty of a woman who has lived long enough to know that comfortable lies are more expensive than uncomfortable truths. The others mean it as a warning, to you, that a woman of your particular capabilities may find that certain doors remain closed to her regardless of what she proves herself capable of. The room was quiet. They think I've overstepped, Emily said. They think you are outside the space you were assigned, Mrs. Alderton corrected gently. Which is not the same thing, though they will tell you it is. Emily looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about the morning after her wedding, sitting at the kitchen table with Mrs. Higgins's ledgers and her cup of tea, and the simple, unadorned task of understanding the place she had come to live. She thought about 6 weeks in the East Library, with the cold coming through the windows and the candle burning lower, and the picture assembling itself in her records number by number, page by page, with the specific satisfaction of a mind engaged in work it is genuinely built for. She had not done any of it to be admirable or remarkable, or to prove a point about women's capabilities to anyone. She had done it because a thing needed doing, and she was capable of doing it, and standing aside, because someone might find her capability inconvenient, had never once occurred to her as a real option. "I know what they'll say," Emily said finally. "I have always known." Mrs. Alderton nodded. She picked up her cup. "I thought you should hear it from a friend rather than a stranger." "Yes." Emily looked at her. "Thank you. Truly." After Mrs. Alderton left, Emily sat alone in the front parlor for a few minutes in the afternoon light, which was thin and early summer and honest. In the way that light is sometimes honest when there is no one performing for it. She thought about what lay ahead. The legal proceedings, the depositions, the inevitable moment when this story stopped being private and became public, because these things always did. The attention that would come with that, the admiration Mrs. Alderton mentioned, and the other things she mentioned, the warning dressed up as concern. She was not afraid of it, but she felt the weight of it, and she thought that was probably right. Feeling weight of something real was not the same as being crushed by it. She was still sitting there when Thomas found her. He stood in the doorway, his own front parlor, his own house, but he stood in the doorway as though checking whether he was welcome, which was something she had never seen him do. "Mrs. Alderton's visit," he said. "Was it about the situation?" "People are talking," Emily told him. "It was going to happen." Thomas came into the room. He did not sit. He moved to the window and stood with his hands at his back, looking out, which was a posture she had come to understand. He used when he was working through something he had not yet resolved. "There was a letter this morning," he said. "From the Hargreaves. They were expected at dinner next month. They've written to cancel." Emily understood immediately. The Hargreaves were connected to Whitmore through two family alliances. They were choosing a side before they were required to. "Others will follow," she said. "Yes." He turned from the window. "Some because of Whitmore, some because—" He stopped, looked at her directly. "Some because of what is being said about you, about what you did, about whether it was—" His jaw tightened. "Appropriate." The word landed in the room between them with all its weight. "And what do you intend to do?" Emily asked. "When people say that to your face?" Thomas Bradford looked at her. He had the look of a man who has been asking himself exactly this question for some days, and has arrived at an answer that costs him something, and is choosing to pay it anyway. "Defend you," he said, simply. "The same as I would defend any person whose conduct was beyond reproach, and whose only fault was that it made smaller people uncomfortable." Emily looked at him for a long moment. She was not ready to call it transformation. She knew better than to call something transformation when it was still in the process of becoming. But she recognized what it was, the early, effortful, genuine shape of a man who has decided that who he was is not the same thing as who he has to be. "Then that is what you'll do," she said. And she believed him, which was its own kind of beginning. It was a week after that conversation that Emily found the letter. She had not been looking for it. She had been going through a file of Thomas's personal correspondence. He had asked her to organize it, which she recognized as both a practical request and a gesture that cost his pride something, and she had nearly set it aside with the rest of the social invitations from 1814 before something made her unfold it. It was from Whitmore, dated 3 months before Emily and Thomas had become engaged. It was a letter of recommendation, which was not in itself unusual. Whitmore had written several on Thomas's behalf over the years to various clubs and associations. But this one was different. This one recommended Thomas as a prospective husband, to a young woman's father in Derbyshire, a young woman who Emily discovered over the next 4 hours of careful, increasingly appalled research had a family fortune approximately 3 times the size of her own. The young woman's family had declined, and 2 months later, Thomas had begun his courtship of Emily Winthrop. Emily sat with the letter for a long time. She was not naive. She had never been naive about the pragmatics of how marriages were arranged in 1816. She had understood from the beginning that Thomas had chosen her for reasons that were partly mostly practical. She had not allowed herself to believe otherwise. But she had permitted herself to believe that the choice, whatever its origins had been, genuinely his. This letter suggested something else. It suggested that Whitmore had been involved in the selection of Thomas's wife, that he had guided the failed courtship in Derbyshire and quite possibly steered Thomas toward Emily, who was less wealthy, less connected, and therefore to a man who had business reasons for keeping Thomas's attention away from certain kinds of scrutiny significantly more convenient. She needed to be more manageable. That was what Whitmore had wanted. A wife who would not look too closely, who would stay in her assigned rooms and manage her assigned duties and leave the business of Bradford Estate to the experienced men who had always handled it. Emily set the letter down on her desk. She looked at it. She thought about the wedding night, about Thomas's voice, pleasantly public, completely certain. "You will never be my equal." She thought about whether those words had been his alone, or whether Whitmore had had a hand in that too, in the shape of Thomas's confidence in the specific flavor of his dismissal, in the careful architecture of a man who believed his wife would stay where she was put. She thought about 6 weeks in the cold library building a case that no one could dismiss. And then she thought about what it meant, what it really meant, that she had built it anyway. She picked up the letter. She held it with both hands. And she felt in the quiet of her study, with the afternoon going long and golden. Outside the window, something that was not anger and not grief, but was in some ways more powerful than either. She felt absolutely and clearly the difference between a woman who had been set in a place and a woman who knew her own ground. She had never needed Thomas Bradford to tell her what she was worth. She had come into this house with that knowledge already intact, and no letter, no arrangement, no man in any room she had ever walked into had been able to take it from her. She put the letter in the file. She picked up her pen. She had work to do. Emily did not show Thomas the letter that night. She thought about it. She turned the question over while she dressed for dinner, while she sat across from him at the long table, while she listened to him speak about the solicitor's timeline and what Mr. Pierce had advised about the speed of filing. She watched Thomas's face in the candlelight, the new quality. It had the openness that had replaced the performed certainty, and she made a decision that surprised even herself. She needed to know more before she handed him another wound, because that was what it would be. The letter would not just tell Thomas that Whitmore had stolen from him. It would tell him that Whitmore had shaped him, had positioned him, had chosen his wife the way you choose a piece in a game for what she couldn't do rather than what she could. And Thomas Bradford was a man who was only just beginning to understand how much of what he had believed about himself had been built on other people's architecture. Handing him that letter, before she understood the full structure of what Whitmore had constructed, could break something that was only now carefully, tentatively beginning to be rebuilt. So she waited. And while she waited, she worked. She wrote to her father in Yorkshire. Not about the letter, not yet, but about Richard Whitmore. Her father was a quiet man, a scholar, a person of no particular social consequence, but he had spent 40 years in the company of books and records and had developed the particular habit of serious readers. He knew people who knew things. He had a friend in London, a retired clerk from the Inns of Court, who had spent 20 years in commercial law and had the memory of a man who had catalogued every case he had ever touched. Emily asked her father to ask his friend a very specific question. She wanted to know if Richard Whitmore had ever been involved in any legal matter, any dispute, any inquiry, any case that had been settled quietly or quietly abandoned involving financial irregularities. She sent the letter on a Tuesday. She received the response the following Thursday, and it was longer than she had anticipated, and considerably worse than she had feared. Whitmore had done this before, not to Bradford Estate, not under his own name in any proceeding that had reached a court. But the clerk remembered a matter from 1808, a commercial arrangement in Derbyshire. Two brothers who had trusted Whitmore with a supply contract, who had lost a significant portion of their business over 3 years before they understood what was happening, and who had ultimately accepted a private settlement, because Whitmore's solicitor had made it very clearly understood that public proceedings would be expensive, slow, and uncertain, and that the brothers were not wealthy enough to survive the cost of proving what everyone already knew. The settlement had been sealed. The brothers had moved. The matter had vanished from public record the way these things always vanished, not because they didn't happen, but because the men who could have made them matter had decided the price of certainty was too high. Emily read the letter standing in her study, still in her morning dress, and she felt something move through her that was colder than anger and more focused. Whitmore had not stumbled into fraud through opportunity. He had done it before with someone else and walked away from it. He had learned from the experience. He had refined his methods. He had come to Bradford Estate with 20 years of Thomas's father's trust already banked, and 4 years of his own careful work already done, and he had been so confident in the structure he had built that he had not even bothered to wonder when Thomas married whether the wife might be the vulnerability he had not accounted for. He had looked at Emily Winthrop and seen exactly what he had designed for Thomas to see. He had been catastrophically wrong. She folded the letter. She put it in the file with the first letter, the recommendation, the Derbyshire family, the shape of the trap Whitmore had set. Then she went to find Thomas. He was in the stable yard talking to his head groom about a horse that had thrown a shoe the previous evening. She waited until he saw her. She never interrupted him. With staff present had learned early that the way power operated in a house depended on certain visible structures being maintained, and when he excused himself and walked toward her, she could see from his face that he knew the way. You know when a person who has been patient is about to be patient no longer. "I need to show you something," Emily said. "2 things, and I need you to read both of them before you say anything." He read them in his study at his desk, while Emily stood at the window with her back to him, because she understood that some things were easier to absorb without being watched. She heard the sound of paper, the silence between the 2 letters, the longer silence after the second one. "He recommended me," Thomas said, "to Hargreaves, in Derbyshire." "Yes, he recommended me as a prospective husband, to a family whose fortune is considerable, yes." "And when they declined?" "He directed your attention to my family." Emily turned from the window. "I don't know whether he suggested my name specifically, or whether you arrived at it through a process he simply didn't interfere with. But the timing and his interest in the outcome is not coincidental." Thomas was looking at the letters, not reading them anymore, looking at them the way you look at something that has changed shape, and you are still adjusting to the new shape it has become. "He wanted you to marry someone who wouldn't look at the books," he said, not to Emily, more to himself, following the logic to its end. "He needed you occupied with a wife who would be appropriately grateful for her position and appropriately confined to it." Emily kept her voice even, factual. "I was in his assessment the ideal candidate, respectable enough not to embarrass you, modest enough not to threaten him." Thomas looked up. "He was wrong," Thomas said. "Spectacularly," Emily agreed. A beat of silence. Something moved across Thomas's face, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one dark-edged and involuntary, the expression of a man who has just understood an irony too large to process, without at least acknowledging it existed. Then it was gone, and what replaced it was harder. "He chose you," Thomas said, "because he believed you would be nothing, and you used everything he gave you to destroy him." Emily looked at her husband. "I used everything I am," she said, which he never bothered to find out. Thomas was silent for a long moment. Then he picked up both letters, stood, and moved to the writing desk in the corner of the room. He pulled out a sheet of paper. He dipped his pen. "I'm writing to Mr. Pierce today," he said. "These go with the rest of the evidence." "Good," Emily said. "Emily." She stopped at the door. Thomas had his pen in his hand, but he was not yet writing. He was looking at the desk, and his voice, when he spoke, was the one she had heard from him only a few times. The one without performance, without management, without the careful engineering of a man who has always known how he appears. "I need to ask you something honestly, and I need you to answer me honestly." "When have I done otherwise?" She returned without heat. A brief pause. "Never." He turned to look at her. "When you came into this house, when you began looking at the books, that first morning, did you already know about Whitmore?" Emily considered the question with the care it deserved. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "I didn't know what or how large. I knew from the numbers that something in the structure of this estate was not functioning the way it should." Whitmore became a specific focus when I saw the pattern of the contract alterations. "But no, I did not come here knowing. I came here paying attention." She held his gaze. "Which is something I was going to do regardless." He nodded slowly. "Why?" he asked. "You could have come here and been what I expected." What he expected. It would have been considerably easier. Emily thought about her father's house, about the long evenings at the kitchen table with the accounts spread out, and her father watching her work with the specific pride of a man who sees his own best qualities reflected in his child. She thought about her mother, who had managed a modest household with the precision and dignity of someone who understood that the work of keeping a family intact was real work. Serious work. Work that deserved the full application of an intelligent mind. Easier than what? Emily asked. Than knowing, than seeing. She shook her head once. "I don't know how to do that, Thomas. I don't know how to walk into a room and choose not to understand it. I never have." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to his letter. "I'm glad of it," he said quietly. Emily left him to write. The legal proceedings began formally in the second week of June. Mr. Pierce filed the documentation with a speed and precision that reflected both his professional competence and his genuine appreciation for the quality of the evidence he had been handed. He had told Emily privately on his second visit that he had been in commercial law for 23 years, and that the organization of her documentation was as good as anything he had seen from a trained professional. He said it with the slight discomfort of a man who means a compliment genuinely, but is not entirely sure the receiving of it is appropriate. Emily thanked him and asked about the timeline. Whitmore retained his own solicitor, a man named Greer, from Leeds, who had a reputation for making proceedings complicated and expensive in ways that discouraged plaintiffs. Greer sent 3 letters in the first 2 weeks, each one escalating in its suggestions that the Bradford evidence was circumstantial, misinterpreted, and potentially the product of a domestic misunderstanding rather than a genuine commercial inquiry. Thomas read the letters and handed them to Emily without comment. Emily read them and wrote detailed responses for Mr. Pierce, demolishing each of Greer's arguments with a precision that Mr. Pierce described with his dry professional understatement as thorough. But the legal proceedings, necessary as they were not the most immediate difficulty. The most immediate difficulty was everything happening outside the legal proceedings, the social machinery of Yorkshire and the surrounding counties grinding into motion around the Bradford case in the specific way that machinery grinds when powerful interests feel threatened. Whitmore had allies. 20 years of cultivated relationships, carefully maintained, generously supported men who had benefited from his connections and his introductions and his particular talent for being useful at the right moments. These men were not villains. Most of them didn't know what Whitmore had done, but they knew that Thomas Bradford's wife had assembled a case against a man they liked and trusted, and they responded the way people respond when their comfortable understanding of the world is threatened. They found reasons to doubt the threat. The invitations that were declined increased. At church on Sunday mornings, certain conversations ended before Emily reached them. At a dinner hosted by a local magistrate in mid-June, an invitation Thomas almost didn't accept, and that Emily insisted they honor because retreat was not a strategy she intended to employ. She felt the specific texture of a room that has decided how to treat someone before she arrived. She moved through it the way she moved through everything, steadily. With the focused awareness of a woman who is gathering information, even when she appears to be making small talk, who is taking the measure of every person in the room, not for the purpose of managing them, but for the more fundamental purpose of understanding them accurately. It was at that dinner that she first understood the larger shape of what Whitmore was attempting. She was standing near the east wall in conversation with Mrs. Alderton when she heard the voice behind her mail quiet, designed to carry only to the people immediately proximate. Poor Bradford. Married a woman who thinks she understands business. Now his name is in every solicitor's office in the county. She did not turn. She did not change expression. She watched Mrs. Alderton's face, which tightened briefly and then smoothed, and she understood from that tightening exactly who had spoken without needing to look. Lord Ashby, 60 years old, connected to Whitmore through a shared interest in several northern trade routes. A man of genuine consequence in the county, the kind of man whose opinion circulated. She waited. 2 minutes later, she heard his voice again, and this time it had found a larger audience. The difficulty is that the Bradford woman has put her husband in an untenable position. Whatever one thinks of Whitmore, and I've known the man 30 years, excellent fellow, these accusations made public as they've been made public damage Bradford's own standing. A man whose domestic arrangements lead him into public disputes is a man whose judgment must be questioned. Emily turned, slowly, completely composed. She turned with the kind of deliberateness that makes a room take notice, not because of the movement, but because of the quality of attention it carries. Lord Ashby was holding court near the fireplace, with 4 men who were listening to him with the particular deference that powerful older men tend to collect. He had not seen her turn. He was mid-sentence. One wonders, he continued, whether Bradford was properly advised before entering into Lord Ashby. Thomas's voice came from across the room. Clear, carrying. The voice of a man who has made a decision. Thomas moved through the room without hurry, which was more effective than hurrying, and people stepped back for him, the way they always stepped back for Thomas Bradford when he was moving with purpose, which was one of the things about him that remained unchanged, the physical authority, the weight of his presence. He stopped beside Lord Ashby with his hands at his back. I believe, Thomas said at a volume the entire room could hear if they chose to, that you were about to question my judgment. Ashby had the good sense to hesitate. But he was 60 years old, and a lord, and he had not been called to account in a social setting in a great many years. He straightened. I was observing that the current situation reflects on the stability of your... My wife, Thomas said, identified a fraud that has cost this estate a significant sum over 4 years. She identified it in her first weeks here when no one else had seen it. She documented it with a rigor that my own solicitor describes as exceptional. And she did all of this while being told repeatedly by me and by others to remain within the bounds considered appropriate for a woman of her position. He paused. One breath. I am not questioning her judgment. I am grateful for it. I would suggest that the rest of this county follow my example. The room was very quiet. Ashby looked at him. Bradford, he said low and controlled, you understand that defending her in this manner? Yes, Thomas said. I do understand it, completely. He held the older man's gaze without moving. Is there anything else you'd like to say about my domestic arrangements? Ashby looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked away. He raised his glass. He said something to the man beside him about the wine, and the conversation moved, and the room breathed again. But the silence had already done its work. Everyone in that room had heard Thomas Bradford defend his wife. Everyone would remember it, and everyone would, over the days that followed, make a choice about what they thought of it. Emily had not moved from her position near the east wall. Mrs. Alderton was looking at her with an expression that Emily could not immediately read. Well, Mrs. Alderton said quietly. Yes, Emily agreed. She crossed the room slowly, and when she reached Thomas's side, she did not take his arm, because she was not that kind of woman, and this was not that kind of moment. But she stood beside him, and she looked out at the room, and she felt the particular solidness of standing on ground you have earned rather than been assigned. Thomas, without looking at her, said very quietly, for her alone, I should have done that months ago. You didn't know how yet, Emily said, equally quiet. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but had something of one in it. No, he said. I didn't. Whitmore made his move 3 days later. Emily had known it was coming. The dinner, Thomas's public, Ashby's humiliation, it had accelerated something that was already moving. She had felt it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. Not dramatic, not sudden. Just the unmistakable sense that the air is organizing itself toward something. What she had not anticipated was the form it would take. A letter arrived for Thomas, hand-delivered by a private courier, sealed with an unfamiliar mark. Thomas brought it to Emily's study without opening it, which she noted 2 months ago. He would not have thought to do that. She opened it with him present. It was not from Whitmore. It was from Greer Whitmore's solicitor. And it was not a legal communication. It was a threat. Precisely worded, beautifully managed, legally invisible, but a threat in every meaningful sense. It alleged that certain financial records from the Bradford estate, recently submitted as evidence in the inquiry, had been selectively assembled to exclude information that would materially alter their interpretation. It suggested that a full audit of the Bradford accounts would reveal irregularities beyond those attributable to Whitmore. It named no specifics. It didn't need to. The implication was crystalline: cooperate, withdraw, or Bradford estate itself goes under scrutiny. Thomas read it twice. Then he put it on Emily's desk very carefully, the way you put down something you are trying not to throw. He's going to manufacture evidence, Thomas said. His voice was controlled, too controlled. He's going to invent irregularities in our records and use them to muddy the waters enough that... He doesn't need to manufacture them, Emily said. Thomas looked at her sharply. I found 2 genuine discrepancies in the Bradford records, she said. From before Whitmore's involvement. One in 1808, one in 1811. Both small, both explainable, neither of them significant. She met his eyes. I included them in Mr. Pierce's materials, with full documentation of their explanations. The silence stretched. You included them. Thomas's voice had a quality she couldn't immediately identify. Every discrepancy, explained or unexplained, major or minor. Because if our case is built on a selective presentation of the evidence, it can be attacked as selective. Our case is built on everything, so that when someone claims we've hidden something, Mr. Pierce can show them the precise page where we disclosed it ourselves. Emily folded Greer's letter. Whitmore's threat assumes we have something to hide. We don't. That is the difference between his case and ours. Thomas sat down in the small chair. He sat in it the way a man sits when the ground has shifted enough that he needs a moment to recalibrate. You thought of this, he said, weeks ago, before he moved. I thought of what he was likely to do, Emily said. And I made sure we had already done the thing that removes his best weapon. The look on Thomas Bradford's face in that moment was one that Emily would carry with her for the rest of her life. Not because it was romantic or dramatic, but because it was real in a way that very few moments between them had been real. It was the look of a man who has genuinely for the first time seen something he was looking directly at. Emily. His voice was very quiet. She waited. I have spent 9 months, he said, being protected by a woman I told could never be my equal. He stopped, looked at his hands, looked at her. What does that make me? A man who didn't know what he had, Emily said. Yet. She picked up Greer's letter and held it out to him. Write to Mr. Pierce, she said. Today. Send him this and tell him to prepare for an attempted counterclaim. He'll know what to do. Thomas took the letter. He stood. He walked to the door. Then he turned back with his hand on the frame in a posture that she recognized. It was the same posture she had used on that first morning, standing at the door of his study when she had told him about the household accounts, and he had not listened. I read the household accounts this morning, he said. The ones you first brought me in February. The ones I told you were managed by experienced men. Emily looked at him. You were right, he said, on every point. In the first week of our marriage, you were entirely right, and I was exactly what I accused you of being, seeing only what I expected to see. The admission sat in the room between them, clean and real and exactly the size it was. I know, Emily said, gently. I knew then. I know you did. He exhaled. That's the part I'm going to spend some time living with. He left. Emily looked at the empty doorway for a moment. Then she opened her journal and wrote one line. He is beginning to see the room. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday in the 3rd week of July. In the 10 days before it, Bradford Hall existed in a particular kind of suspended state, not quiet, because there was too much to do for quiet, but contained everything pulled tight and purposeful around the approaching center of gravity that the hearing represented. Mr. Pierce came twice. Emily worked through the final organization of documents with him for 6 hours on the first visit, and Thomas sat with them for all of it, asking questions that Pierce answered with increasing respect, and that Emily answered with the precision of someone who has lived with these numbers long enough to know them the way you know the rooms of a house in the dark. On the second visit, Pierce brought news that he delivered with the careful neutrality of a man who understands that information is not the same thing as its interpretation. Whitmore had approached 2 of the witnesses listed in Bradford's materials. He had not, as far as Pierce could determine, offered money. He had offered something in some ways more effective, the suggestion that cooperation with Bradford's case would damage their standing with certain connected families. One witness had already declined to testify. A second was wavering. Emily listened to this without visible reaction. "Threatening people who are trying to tell the truth," Thomas said. "He's protecting himself," Emily said, "the way he always has, by managing the space around him." She looked at Pierce. "Who is the wavering witness?" "A supplier, man named Crow, managed deliveries for Bradford Estate through Whitmore's arrangement. He has records that corroborate your documentation of the supply overcharges." Pierce paused. "He is in a difficult position. Whitmore has indicated that certain future contracts may be unavailable to him if he—" "Where is he?" Emily asked. Pierce told her. She looked at Thomas. "I'd like to speak with him," she said. Thomas looked at her. "Alone?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I think it would be better." She could see him resist the instinct to question it. She could actually see the moment he decided to trust her instead. And she noted that too. The small things were as significant as the large ones, sometimes more. "All right," Thomas said. She went the next morning. Crow lived in a modest house on the edge of the nearest market town, a practical, weathered man of about 50, with the careful eyes of someone who has spent his working life measuring the gap between what he can say and what he cannot afford to say. He met Emily at the door with the wary deference of a man who does not know what to do with a gentlewoman arriving unannounced, and has decided that caution is the safest default. She asked to come in. He stepped back and let her. They sat at his kitchen table, not unlike the morning she had sat at Mrs. Higgins's table. She thought, though, the nature of what she was asking for was considerably higher stakes. "You're afraid," Emily said, directly, not unkindly. Crow looked at his hands. "I have a family," he said. 3 children. The contracts I run through Whitmore's network, it's most of my income. If he blocks me from— "Whitmore is going to lose," Emily said. Crow looked at her. "He has done this before," she said. "In Derbyshire, 1808, 2 brothers named Fielding. He did to them what he did to Bradford Estate, and when they moved against him, he threatened them the same way he is threatening you. And they made the same calculation you are making, and they walked away." She held his gaze. "And Whitmore walked away too. Free. With everything he'd taken, and the knowledge that he could do it again. Which is exactly what he did. On a larger scale. For 4 more years." Crow was very still. "I have documentation of the Derbyshire matter," Emily continued. "My solicitor has it. It establishes a pattern of behavior. It is part of our case. But your testimony—" She paused. "Your records of the supply deliveries and the discrepancies between what was ordered and what was billed, your direct knowledge of how the overcharging operated, that is not replaceable. That is the difference between a case that a jury comprehends immediately and a case that requires explanation." The kitchen was quiet. "If Whitmore wins," Emily said, "what happens to the next man he does this to? What happens to the next family? Because there will be one. He has done this twice that we can document. He will do it again to someone who has less than Thomas Bradford has, and no one like me sitting in the East Library for 6 weeks with a candle and a very serious objection." Crow looked at her for a long moment. "You're asking me to take a risk," he said. "I'm asking you to stop him," Emily said. "The risk is real. I won't pretend otherwise, but I can tell you this. Bradford Estate will honor every contract your business currently holds with it at the current rates for the next 5 years, committed in writing, regardless of the outcome of this hearing. That is not leverage. That is fairness. I am not buying your testimony. I am removing the threat that is being used against you so that you can make a free choice." Crow stared at her. That's Mrs. Bradford. That kind of commitment would require. My husband has already agreed to it, Emily said. If you need it in writing before you decide, Mr. Pierce can have the document to you by tomorrow morning. She had asked Thomas for it 3 days ago. He had agreed without hesitation, had not even asked her to explain. Her reasoning had simply said yes. She had noted that too. Crow was quiet for a long time. Outside the market town, went about its morning carts, passing a dog barking somewhere down the lane. The ordinary world, continuing with complete indifference to the enormity of what was being decided at this kitchen table. "All right," Crow said, very quietly. "All right, Mrs. Bradford." Emily exhaled, slowly, allowing nothing to show on her face until she was sure she had it managed. "Thank you," she said, "for yourself and for the next person who won't have to face what you've faced." She stood. She shook his hand directly, firmly, the way her father had always shaken hands with people regardless of their station, because he had believed that the handshake was a form of honesty, and she left. She was halfway back to Bradford Hall before her hands stopped being entirely steady. Not from fear. From the particular release of a tension that has been held for so long, it has become structural, and when it finally lets go, the body doesn't quite know what to do with the space it leaves. She had it. They had it. The case was complete. The hearing was 10 days away. And Richard Whitmore, for the first time in his very long and very careful career, had run out of road. But there was one more thing. It arrived on a Saturday 6 days before the hearing in the form of a visitor. Emily had not expected a woman in her mid-40s, quietly dressed, arriving alone in a modest hired carriage, who asked to see Mrs. Bradford specifically, and who gave her name to the footman as Mrs. Catherine Fielding, one of the Derbyshire brothers' wives. Emily went to the front parlor herself. Mrs. Fielding was a composed woman with the specific composure of someone who has been through something and come out the other side of it, not softened, but clarified. She sat without fidgeting. She met Emily's eyes without preamble. "You wrote to my husband," she said, "through your solicitor, about the case." "I did," Emily said. "I needed to document the pattern of his behavior. I hoped your husband might be willing to provide a statement." "My husband is dead," Mrs. Fielding said. "He died in 1813. The stress of what happened, the financial loss, and then the settlement, and the years of trying to recover." She stopped, started again. "He did not survive it." The parlor was very quiet. Emily looked at Mrs. Fielding and felt the weight of what she was hearing settle across her like something cold and real. "I'm so sorry," she said, and meant it absolutely. "I came," Mrs. Fielding continued, "because I want to give you whatever you need. I have copies of the original contracts. I have the correspondence from Whitmore's solicitor. I have the settlement agreement which my husband signed under pressure and which he spent the rest of his life regretting." She opened the bag she was carrying. "And I have letters from Whitmore himself, written in 1808 and 1809, before he understood how the situation would proceed. Letters that are quite explicit about the nature of what he did." She placed a folder on the table between them. Emily looked at the folder. She looked at Mrs. Fielding. "He killed my husband," Mrs. Fielding said. Not with drama, with the flat, exact precision of a woman who has had 8 years to understand what she is saying. Not directly, not in a way the law recognizes, but as surely as if he had. Her voice remained steady. "I want him stopped. I want there to be a record. I want someone to look at what he did and call it what it was." Emily reached across the table and put her hand on top of the folder. "There will be a record," she said. "I promise you." Mrs. Fielding looked at her. For the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not relief, not quite, but the beginning of a thing that might become relief if it was given enough time and enough confirmation. "People told me," she said, "when I decided to come here that I was throwing good effort after bad, that Whitmore was too connected, that a woman making this kind of trouble." She paused. "Yes," Emily said. "People tell women that." They do," Mrs. Fielding agreed. The two women looked at each other across the parlor table. Two women in 1816 in a world that had arranged itself with considerable care to ensure they could not do what they were doing, and the look between them had in it everything that didn't need to be said because it was already fully understood. "Will you stay?" Emily asked. "For the hearing, I would like Mr. Pierce to speak with you this week if you're willing." "I didn't come all this way to leave before the end," Mrs. Fielding said. Emily smiled. Fully. For the first time in what felt like a very long time. "Good," she said. "Neither did I." Mrs. Fielding stayed in the guest room at the east end of Bradford Hall, the one with the good writing desk and the view of the gardens that Emily had quietly ensured was prepared before she asked the question. She stayed for 6 days. In those 6 days, she and Emily worked alongside Mr. Pierce with the focused, unhurried productivity of people who understand that the time before a reckoning is too valuable to waste on anything that is not the reckoning itself. Pierce met with Mrs. Fielding for 4 hours on the first day. He came out of that meeting with his careful professional composure intact, but with something behind his eyes that was different from what had been there when he went in. He found Emily in the East Library afterward and set his notes on the table beside her and stood for a moment without speaking. "The letters," he said finally. "Whitmore's own letters from 1808. "Yes," Emily said. "They are explicit." "Yes, Mrs. Bradford." He paused. He had a way of pausing that meant he was about to say something he had deliberated over. "I have practiced law for 23 years. I have handled fraud cases. I have handled cases where powerful men used their power to harm people with less of it, and then used that same power to escape accountability." Another pause. "I have not often walked into a hearing with a case this complete." Emily looked at him. "Then let's make sure we don't waste it," she said. Chakag. Thomas met Mrs. Fielding at dinner on her second evening. Emily had prepared him for it, had told him that Mrs. Fielding was the widow of one of the Derbyshire brothers, that her husband had not survived what Whitmore had done to him, that she had come bearing documents that removed the last possible avenue of defense Whitmore's solicitor might attempt. Thomas had listened to all of this without interrupting, which was something she was still not entirely accustomed to. At dinner, he was careful with Mrs. Fielding. Not performatively solicitous, not the version of Thomas Bradford that managed people with the smooth, practiced warmth of a host, but genuinely careful. The way you are careful with someone who has been through something and doesn't need your sympathy as much as your steadiness. He asked about her family. Her children. 3 of them teenagers, now doing reasonably well, given everything. He did not ask about her husband's death. He did not offer the usual weighted condolences that social convention provided. He simply listened to her talk about her children, with the specific real attention of a man who is trying one conversation at a time to be different from what he was. After dinner, when Mrs. Fielding had retired, Thomas and Emily sat in the front parlor with their tea in the particular silence that had developed between them over the past weeks. A silence that was no longer empty, but occupied, furnished with things that didn't need to be said because they had already been established. "He destroyed that family," Thomas said. "Yes. Her husband is dead because of what Whitmore did. Indirectly, but yes." Thomas turned his cup in his hands. It was a gesture Emily had come to recognize the physical form of him working through something he hadn't finished with yet. "I gave him the access," Thomas said. "I gave him the trust and the name and the complete unquestioning cover that let him do it again on a larger scale for longer. If I had been paying attention, if I had looked at my own books the way you looked at them in your first week here." "Stop," Emily said. He looked at her. "I know what you're doing," she said, "and I understand why. But Whitmore is responsible for what Whitmore did. You were a man who trusted badly and looked away from things that were inconvenient to see. That is a failing. It is not a crime." She held his gaze. "The way you correct it is by seeing clearly now, not by adding your guilt to the list of things that need to be managed." The room was quiet. "You are remarkably practical," Thomas said, "about things that most people would find a great deal more complicated." "My father used to say that guilt was only useful for about 10 minutes, Emily said. "After that, it's just self-indulgence dressed up as conscience." Something moved across Thomas's face. Not quite a smile more, the internal version of one, the kind that happens when something lands accurately enough to bypass the usual defenses. "I would like to meet your father," he said. "He would find you very interesting," Emily said. Which was the truth, and they both understood what kind of interesting she meant. And the understanding sat between them with a warmth that was new enough to be noticeable. The night before the hearing, Emily could not sleep. She lay in the dark of her room, the room that had been hers since the wedding, the room she had filled gradually with her books and her journal and the organized papers of 6 months of work. And she did not try to force sleep, because she had learned long ago that forcing sleep was a waste of energy that could be used for thinking. She thought about the hearing. She thought about Pierce's timeline and Greer's likely tactics and the order in which the evidence would be presented, and the specific language Pierce had chosen for the 3 key arguments. She thought about Mrs. Fielding's letters and the way Pierce had said they were explicit. She thought about Crow and whether his nerve would hold in the room. And then underneath all of that, she thought about something else. She thought about what came after. It was the first time she had allowed herself to think about it directly. The hearing had been so large, so consuming, such a complete occupation of every available inch of mental space, that what lay beyond it had remained blurred, a future too uncertain to examine closely. But lying in the dark the night before, she let herself look at it. Whitmore would be stopped. She was confident enough of the case to believe that. The documents were too complete, the pattern too clear. Mrs. Fielding's evidence too devastating for any outcome other than the full exposure of what he had done. But exposure was not the same as justice, and justice was not the same as repair. Bradford estate would recover. The financial damage was significant, but survivable, particularly with the contracts restructured and the fraudulent payments documented for potential recovery. Thomas's standing in the county would stabilize his defense of her. At the magistrate's dinner had already shifted something in the social atmosphere. She had noticed some recalibration of opinion that was still in progress, but moving in a direction she recognized as favorable. What she could not predict was the thing that did not belong to documents or depositions or social calculations. She could not predict Thomas. She knew what he was becoming. She had watched it happen with the close attention she brought to everything, the daily increments, the small decisions made differently than they would have been 6 months ago, the cumulative shape of a man in genuine process. It was not a performance. She had been watching Thomas Bradford perform for 9 months, and she knew the difference between a man doing something because it was expected and a man doing something because he had decided to. He had decided to, but deciding to was not the same as arriving. And she did not know, could not know, lying in the dark the night before the hearing, what the man who emerged on the other side of all of this would choose. Whether the gratitude and the respect and the genuine shift she had witnessed would become something else, something more complete. Whether Thomas Bradford, freed from the immediate crisis and returned to the ordinary operations of his life, would move toward her or away from her, or simply stop moving at all, which was in some ways the outcome she feared most, because she had not allowed herself to want things she could not control. But she was beginning to discover that there were things she wanted, and that discovery was considerably more unsettling than anything Whitmore had thrown at her. She turned onto her back and looked at the ceiling, and made a decision that she could feel the shape of before she could name it. Whatever came after, she would meet it the same way she had met everything else, directly, without pretending to be less than she was. That was the only approach she had ever known. It had not failed her yet. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time, but eventually she did. The hearing lasted 9 hours. It was held in a formal chamber in Leeds, presided over by a magistrate named Sir William Hartley, a man of 60, known for impatience with theatrics, and for reading documents with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the truth of any matter was located in specifics, not summaries. This suited Emily enormously. She sat in the gallery with Mrs. Fielding beside her. Thomas sat at the table with Pierce. Whitmore sat at the opposite table with Greer, who was a compact, quick-eyed man, who had spent the first 20 minutes of the proceeding attempting to establish through procedural challenges that certain categories of evidence were inadmissible, and who had spent those 20 minutes being systematically, pleasantly, and completely overruled. Emily watched Whitmore more than she watched anyone else. How was controlled? He was very good at being controlled. 30 years of practice of sitting in rooms where something important was being decided and projecting the specific calm of a man who is confident in the outcome. He sat with his hands folded. He listened to Pierce's opening presentation without visible reaction. But Emily was watching his hands. And his hands approximately 40 minutes into Pierce's presentation around the moment, Pierce produced the documentation of the pattern of contract alterations. 18 specific instances, each one traced from the original document to its altered version to the resulting payment discrepancy. His hands tightened, just slightly, for just a moment. She noted it the way she noted everything. 2 hours and Pierce called Crow. Crow walked to the witness position with the gait of a man who has made a decision and is not going to reconsider it, but would prefer the whole business to be over as quickly as possible. He sat. He was sworn. Pierce asked his questions with the precision of someone who has rehearsed the sequence enough times to know exactly where each answer would land. Crow answered. He answered every question. His voice was flat and factual and not quite steady, but the facts themselves were steel. He described the supply arrangements. He described the discrepancies between what was ordered and what was billed. He described 2 specific conversations with Whitmore's agent, in which the overcharges had been described as administrative fees, which Crow had understood to be irregular, and had documented and had kept documentation of, because, as he said with a plainness that silenced the room, "I thought someone would want to know about it eventually." Greer cross-examined him for 40 minutes. He was skilled. He found every available pressure point: the contract. Crow held the business relationship, the possibility of misremembering the absence of certain documents from Crow's records. Crow held. He did not embellish, he did not elaborate, he did not give Greer anything beyond the direct question and the direct answer. When Crow stepped down, Emily let out a breath she had been managing for 40 minutes. Mrs. Fielding put her hand briefly on Emily's arm. Emily looked at her. "He held," Mrs. Fielding said quietly. "He held," Emily confirmed. The letters came in the afternoon. Pierce presented them with the care of a man handling something fragile, which they were in every sense, being 8-year-old documents, written by a man who had not yet understood that he would one day be in a room like this one, having them read aloud by a solicitor with excellent diction. The letters were explicit. They described in Whitmore's own hand the structure of what he had done to the Fielding brothers. Not in those terms, he had been careful with language even then, writing in the oblique shorthand of a man who assumed his correspondence was private. But the meaning was clear, and Pierce had prepared a precise annotation of each relevant passage that left no room for alternative interpretation. Greer objected to the letters. Twice. On different grounds. Sir William Hartley overruled him both times with the particular weariness of a man who has decided that he has heard enough procedural argument for one day. When the second objection was overruled, Whitmore leaned toward Greer and said something very quietly. Emily couldn't hear it. She didn't need to. She could read the tilt of Whitmore's head, the quality of the gesture, the controlled private communication of a man who is beginning to understand that the room has turned and is now receiving instructions to pivot. 20 minutes later, Greer requested a brief adjournment. Hartley granted 10 minutes. Pierce came to the gallery railing during the adjournment. He looked at Emily with his dry, careful expression. "He's going to try to settle," Pierce said low. Emily's pulse jumped once. She kept her face composed. "Today. That's my assessment. The letters were more than he anticipated, I think." Pierce paused. "If he approaches us with a settlement offer, the decision is Mr. Bradford's, but I wanted you to know what I believe is coming." Emily nodded. She looked across the chamber to where Thomas sat at the solicitor's table, his back to her, his shoulders square, and his posture, the one she recognized as controlled and attentive. He had been like that all day, steadier than she had expected, genuinely steadier, listening to Pierce's presentation with the focused engagement of a man who understood the stakes and had decided to trust the process. She wished for the first time that day that she were sitting beside him instead of in the gallery. The adjournment ended. Greer did not make a settlement approach during the hearing. He pivoted instead to his prepared alternative strategy, which was a more aggressive version of what he had been attempting all day, a challenge to the sourcing of the Bradford records, a suggestion that the chain of custody had not been properly maintained, a series of technically precise but substantively empty arguments that Hartley listened to with diminishing patience. At 5 o'clock, Hartley called for the day's proceedings to conclude and announced that he would review the submitted materials and reconvene with his findings in 3 days. 3 days. The 3 days were the longest of Emily's marriage and among the longest of her life. Not because she doubted the outcome. She had spent 6 months building a case she was confident in, and another 6 days adding Mrs. Fielding's evidence to it, and another 9 hours watching it survive a full day of adversarial challenge. She did not doubt the case. She was discovering in those 3 days that the end of a long fight has its own particular texture, and it is not comfortable. The thing you have been moving toward stops being abstract and becomes real, and the reality of it brings with it all the feelings that the movement itself had kept at bay. Mrs. Fielding left on the second day. Emily saw her to her carriage herself. They stood at the front of Bradford Hall in the early morning, and Mrs. Fielding held Emily's hands briefly and looked at her with those clarified eyes of hers. "Whatever he decides," Mrs. Fielding said, and Emily understood she did not mean Hartley, "You'll be all right." "I know," Emily said. "I mean it as more than reassurance." Mrs. Fielding released her hands. "I mean it as observation. You are the kind of woman who would be all right in any circumstance. I've known very few of them." Emily watched the carriage until it turned out of the drive and disappeared from view. Then she went inside and worked. It was what she did when she needed to be steady. It was what had always worked. Thomas found her in the East Library late that evening, the second evening the night before Hartley's ruling, and stood in the doorway with the same checking quality he had brought to the parlor after Mrs. Alderton's visit. The quality of a man confirming he is welcome before he enters. "You haven't eaten since this morning," he said. "I had tea at 4. "Tea is not eating." Emily looked up from her papers. Thomas was leaning against the doorframe with his coat off and his sleeves rolled, and the loose, unself-conscious quality he had been showing in private with increasing frequency, the Thomas Bradford who existed when he had stopped performing for himself. "I'm not hungry," she said. "That isn't the point." He straightened. "Come and eat something. The documents will be there when you get back." She almost argued. She recognized the almost, and then she recognized something underneath it, the awareness that being argued with about eating by a man who was paying attention to whether she had eaten was different from being managed. It was different in a way she didn't have an immediate word for. She put down her pen. She came to dinner. They sat at the smaller table in the breakfast room, not the long formal dining table, and ate the cold supper that had been left, and talked about things that were not the hearing about her father's most recent letter, which had been long and affectionate, and included a botanical observation about the Yorkshire spring that had made Emily laugh. About a book Thomas had been reading reluctantly at her recommendation that he was finding considerably less tedious than he had expected. About the horse that had thrown a shoe 6 weeks ago, and had recovered, and was apparently, according to the head groom, doing something impressively athletic in the paddock. Ordinary things. The texture of a life being lived by two people who had been in the same house for 9 months, and were only now quietly beginning to inhabit it the same way. At the end of dinner, Thomas looked at her across the small table with the undefended quality that she had come to think of as his real face, the one underneath the performed one. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what I want to say to you, after tomorrow, when it's finished." Emily set down her fork. "What have you been thinking?" she asked. "That I don't have the words yet." He held her gaze. "I've been looking for them for several weeks, and they're not. I'm not a man who has practiced saying the things I need to say to you, Emily. I'm a man who has practiced saying things that sounded like what they were without being what they were." He paused. "I don't want to do that with this." The breakfast room was quiet. "Take the time you need," Emily said. "I'm not going anywhere." He nodded. Something in him settled visibly, the way tension settles when something has been said that needed saying, even if it was only the acknowledgement of what remained to be said. "Right," he said. "Good." He poured more tea. She accepted it. They sat in the ordinary furnished silence that was becoming one of the things she valued most about being in a room with him. Hartley's ruling came at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. Pierce sent a rider to Bradford the moment the ruling was announced. Emily was in her study when the rider came. Thomas was with her, had been with her all morning, sitting at the second chair with his own correspondence untouched beside him in the manner of a man who cannot concentrate on anything else, and has decided not to pretend he can. The rider handed the letter to Thomas. Thomas opened it and read it, and handed it to Emily without a word. Emily read it. The ruling was complete. The evidence was found to be credible, well documented, and consistent with a deliberate and sustained pattern of commercial fraud. Richard Whitmore was to be formally investigated by the appropriate authorities. All contracts between Bradford Estate and any Whitmore-connected enterprise were to be immediately reviewed. Financial recovery proceedings were to begin within 30 days. A note at the bottom, in Pierce's own hand. Greer has already contacted me about settlement terms. I will respond per your instructions. Excellent work, Mrs. Bradford. Emily looked up. Thomas was watching her. It's done, she said. He exhaled. It was the longest exhale she had ever heard from him, the sound of something that has been held for a very long time finally being released. It's done, he said. For a moment, neither of them moved. The morning sat around them, the ordinary Bradford Hall morning with its ordinary sounds. The household somewhere in the background, a door closing, a voice in the corridor, continuing without ceremony, as mornings do. Then Thomas stood. He crossed to the window. He stood with his hands at his back, and his posture was not the performing kind, not the managed kind. It was just a man standing at a window with something large moving through him that he was trying to contain. Richard was my friend, he said. For 20 years, he was the person I turned to for advice about exactly the kind of thing he was doing to me. When I couldn't see a solution, I went to Richard. When I needed a perspective, I trusted I went to Richard. He stopped. Everything I thought he was giving me, he was using to take something else. Emily waited. How do you know? Thomas asked. How do you know? How did you come into this house and look at the people in it and understand immediately what I had spent 20 years failing to see? She thought about the answer seriously. I didn't have 20 years of trust in the way, she said finally. I came in fresh, without history, without the particular blindness that comes from caring about people, which is a real blindness, Thomas. It's not stupidity, it's love or something like it. You loved Richard. That meant you couldn't see him. He turned from the window. And you? He asked. The question had a different quality from the others. Lower, more direct. Did you ever? He stopped. Restarted. Was there ever a time when you considered not looking? When it would have been easier to simply stay within the boundaries you'd been given and trust that other people's experience was sufficient? Emily looked at him. No, she said. Not for a single morning. Why not? Because the estate would have failed, she said. And because, she paused, finding the honest version of it, because I don't know how to be in a place and not understand it. And because I made a promise when I married you, Thomas. Not to be decorative or grateful or contained. I promised in the church to be your wife. And I took that seriously, even when you didn't know I had. The room was quiet for a long moment. Thomas moved away from the window. He came toward the desk. He stopped in front of it, and he stood looking at her with the undefended face, the real face, and what was on it was something she had not seen there before. Not admiration, not gratitude, not the complex mixture of guilt and respect that had been building for weeks. What was on his face was recognition. Not of something new, of something that had been there all along, and that he was only now finally completely seeing. I owe you an apology, he said. A real one. Not the kind I offered when I said I should have listened in February. The kind that accounts for all of it. He held her gaze without flinching. For the wedding night. For everything I said, and for the way I said it in front of everyone to make a point that was not a point at all, but just pride. My own pride dressed up as certainty. Emily did not look away. I heard you, she said. I know you did. His jaw was set, not in the old way, not in resistance. In the effort of continuing through something difficult, rather than managing around it. I meant to make you feel small. I meant to establish in that room in front of everyone I knew exactly what order things were in. And you didn't, You didn't react the way I expected, and I told myself it was because you were sensible enough to understand your position." He stopped. "I was wrong. It was because you already knew something I didn't, and you were going to spend the next 9 months proving it whether I wanted you to or not." The morning light was clear and honest, the way morning light sometimes is. "Yes," Emily said. "I was." "I know." Something shifted in his voice. Something came off it, the last remaining layer of management, the last careful engineering. "I spent 9 months being afraid you were my equal, Emily. And the truth is that afraid was not the right word. The truth is that I was afraid you were better." The admission landed in the room between them exactly as he had intended it to. Not as self-flagellation, not as performance. As the exact truth stated at the exact weight it actually had. Emily looked at Thomas Bradford, this man who had told her on their wedding night what she would never be, and who had spent the months since discovering what she was, and she felt something that she had been careful, very careful not to feel for a very long time. She felt the beginning of something real. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness was too simple a word for what was happening, which was more like the decision to build something on ground that had been cleared of what shouldn't have been there in the first place. "You were afraid," she said, "because you had never met anyone who made you work for your own opinion of yourself." She let a breath out. "I don't say that to wound you." "I know," he said. "I know you don't." "Good." She stood. She moved around the desk, around the careful professional distance she had maintained for 9 months, and she stood in front of him without it. "Then hear this also. I did not come into this house expecting to find what I found. I expected a difficult man with entrenched ideas and limited vision, and I expected to manage that the way I manage everything, by finding the structure of it and working within it carefully." She held his gaze. "I did not expect to find someone worth working beside." The word beside landed. He heard it. She watched him hear it, watched the specific quality of a man absorbing a thing that matters, not rushing to respond, but letting it settle to its proper depth. "Is that what this is?" he asked. "I think it could be," Emily said, "if you are willing to continue becoming the man you have been becoming." A pause. The length of a real breath. "What if I fail?" Thomas asked. "I've already demonstrated a considerable capacity for it." "Then you fail and you correct it," Emily said. "The way you have been doing, imperfectly and honestly and without requiring the people around you to pretend that the failure didn't happen." She looked at him steadily. "That is all I have ever asked, Thomas. Not perfection, honesty." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with the grand gesture that the moment in a story like this one would seem to call for. He simply picked up her hand and held it carefully, the way you hold something that matters and that you understand this time you are capable of losing. "I hear you," he said. Emily looked at their joined hands. She thought about her father's kitchen table and the ledgers spread out under lamplight and her mother's lace at her collar on her wedding day, and 6 weeks in a cold library, building a case that no one had asked her to build. She thought about what it meant to know your own worth, so absolutely that no room, no man, no public humiliation could reach the place where it lived. And she thought that this moment, this man, this hand in hers, was not something she had built her case toward. It was something that had happened as a consequence of refusing to be less than she was. Which was, she thought, the only way anything worth having ever arrived. "Good," she said. She did not let go of his hand. The hand-holding lasted approximately 30 seconds before Emily stepped back, which was the right amount of time, and they both knew it. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. And Emily Winthrop Bradford was not a woman who confused a beginning for an ending. Pierce arrived that afternoon with the settlement terms Greer had proposed. He spread them across the desk in the East Library, with the careful neutrality of a man presenting options rather than recommendations. Though his eyes, when he looked at Emily, carried the opinion he was professionally refraining from stating. Thomas read the terms first. Then he slid them to Emily without being asked. She read them in 2 minutes. "No," she said. Pierce nodded slightly, as though she had confirmed something he had expected. Thomas looked at her. "The recovery amount is Insufficient by approximately 40%, Emily said. He's accounting for the documented losses, but not for the compounding cost of 4 years of distorted contracts. The suppliers we overpaid the renegotiation costs will incur to correct the terms. The reputational work required to restore Bradford Estate's standing with partners who began questioning our reliability when the proceedings became public. She set the document down. Greer has written a settlement that looks generous and is not. Mr. Pierce, what is the full calculated loss, including consequential damages? Pierce named a figure. Thomas's jaw tightened. Emily wrote a number on a clean sheet of paper, 80% of Pierce's figure, which was the number below, which in her assessment, the settlement would represent a net loss after legal costs and ongoing remediation expenses, and slid it to Pierce. That is our floor, she said. Not the opening position. The floor. And I want a formal public acknowledgement of the fraud included in the settlement terms. Not a private admission. A document that can be referenced. Pierce looked at the number, then at Emily, then at Thomas. Mr. Bradford, Pierce asked. Thomas looked at the number Emily had written. Whatever she's determined, he said, simply, without qualification. Pierce allowed himself the smallest of professional smiles. I'll convey our position to Greer by end of day. He gathered his papers and left them to it. Greer came back within 24 hours, which told Emily everything she needed to know about how badly Whitmore wanted this resolved before any further proceedings exposed anything else. The counteroffer was better closer, but still not there. Emily and Pierce went back and forth through 2 more rounds over 3 days, and on the 4th day, Greer accepted the terms that Emily had written on that sheet of paper in the East Library, plus the public acknowledgement, plus a formal statement retracting any suggestion that the Bradford documentation had been improperly assembled. That last clause had been Emily's addition on the 3rd day, and it had cost Whitmore something visibly painful, which was precisely why she had added it. Pierce brought the signed agreement to Bradford Hall on a Tuesday morning. He set it on the desk and stood back and let Thomas and Emily read it, and when they looked up, he said with his particular dry understatement, "I believe that concludes the matter." "Thank you, Mr. Pierce," Emily said. "For everything, Mrs. Bradford." He inclined his head. "It has been the most professionally interesting 6 months of my career. I don't say that lightly." He left. The house settled. And Emily sat in her East Library with the signed agreement in front of her, and felt for the first time since the morning after her wedding, when she had opened the first ledger at Mrs. Higgins's kitchen table, the particular quality of silence that exists after something large has been completed. Not peace exactly. Something more specific than peace. The silence of a woman who set out to do something that needed doing, and did it, and who is now sitting in the reality of that fact. Thomas knocked on the open door. "It's your library," Emily pointed out. "It's your library," he returned. "It has been since February." He came in and sat in the small chair and looked at the signed agreement on the desk between them. "It's over," he said. "This part," Emily agreed. He looked at her. "What part isn't over?" "The part where Bradford Estate actually changes," she said. "The documents are signed. Whitmore is finished. But the way this estate operates, the relationships with suppliers, the contract review processes, the transparency of the accounts, none of that corrects itself because a settlement was signed." She met his eyes. "The work that prevented this from happening is the same work that prevents the next thing. It doesn't stop." Thomas held her gaze for a moment. "I know," he said. "I'm not suggesting otherwise." "Good." "I'm suggesting," he continued, "that you might be willing to do it with somewhat less of the distance you've maintained for 9 months. The library was very quiet. Emily looked at him steadily. "What do you mean by distance?" "I mean," Thomas said carefully, "that you have been in this house since February, and you have worked alongside me for 3 months, and you held my hand for 30 seconds on Thursday and stepped back, and I respect that, Emily. I respect every bit of it, but I want to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me the same way." She waited. "Are you keeping your distance because it's what you want?" he asked. "Or because you're waiting to see what I do next?" The question landed with the precision of something that had been aimed very carefully. Emily was quiet for long enough that Thomas's expression shifted not toward doubt, but toward the particular attentiveness of a man who has asked an important question and understands that the honest answer deserves its full time. "Both," she said finally, "simultaneously. In proportions I haven't fully worked out yet." Something in Thomas's face eased not into relief, but into a kind of respect that was itself a form of relief. "That's honest," he said. "It's all I know how to be. I know." He leaned forward slightly in the small chair. "Then let me be equally honest. I have spent 9 months understanding incrementally that I am married to someone who is extraordinary. Not in a way I had categories for when we married. Not in any way I had been taught to recognize or value, or God help me not condescend to." He stopped. "I am not asking you to forgive what I was. I'm asking whether you believe what I am becoming is worth the investment of staying close enough to find out." Emily looked at this man, this complicated, proud, genuinely changing man, and she thought about what Mrs. Fielding had said at the carriage. "You are the kind of woman who would be all right in any circumstance." She had said it as a compliment, and Emily had received it as one, and it was true. She would be all right. The question was whether all right was what she wanted. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said. "Not because I don't have an answer, because the answer I have right now is based on who you've been under pressure. I want to see who you are when there's no crisis to be good through." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," he said. "It's not punishment," Emily said. "It's just accuracy. I deal in accuracy." "I know." The corner of his mouth moved. "Believe me, Emily. After 9 months, I know." The changes at Bradford Estate did not happen all at once. They happened the way real changes always happen, incrementally, imperfectly, with setbacks and recoveries and occasional moments where the old gravity pulled and had to be actively resisted. The accounts were restructured first. Emily designed a new review system, not complex, not burdensome, but consistent with monthly reconciliations that Thomas conducted himself and that were available for Emily's review as a second set of eyes. Not because Thomas could not be trusted. Because 2 sets of eyes were better than 1, and because the lesson of the past 4 years was not that trust was wrong, but that trust without verification was an open door. Thomas implemented the system without argument. He sat with Emily for 3 evenings going through the design of it, asking questions that were genuinely good, making modifications that improved it in 2 specific ways she acknowledged freely. The evening after they finalized it, he looked at the finished document and said with the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who has built something he intends to use, "My father would not have done this." "No," Emily agreed. "How was a good man?" Thomas said. "He trusted the wrong people same as I did, but he was a good man. He never thought to question the structure. He assumed the structure was correct because it had always been there." "Most people do," Emily said. "You don't." "My father taught me that structures are built by people," she said, "which means they can be wrong and they can be corrected, and questioning them is not disrespect. It's just thinking." She paused. He would be mortified to know how rarely that principle is applied. Thomas looked at her with the undefended face. "I want to meet him," he said. "I have wanted to meet him since you first mentioned him, and I want to meet him more every time you talk about him." Emily smiled. It was not the composed, managed expression she had brought to most of their interactions in the early months. It was the real one, the one that showed in her eyes before it reached her mouth, the one her father could always tell from the performed version. "Then invite him," she said. Thomas looked momentarily startled, as though the simplicity of the solution had not occurred to him. Then he picked up his pen. "I'll write this evening," he said. Robert Winthrop arrived at Bradford Hall on a Friday in September, which was 6 weeks after the settlement was signed, and 4 months after Emily had sat in the cold library with a candle and built a case that no one had asked her to build. Howe was 63 years old, slightly built with the same dark eyes as Emily and the same particular quality of attention, the quality of someone who is genuinely interested in where they are and who they are with and what can be learned from both. He arrived with a single trunk and 3 additional boxes of books that he apologized for before he was through the door, and that Thomas arranged to have carried to the guest library without blinking. Emily met her father in the front hall and held his hands and looked at him, and felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't realized was locked, the specific homecoming of being in the presence of someone who has known you since before you knew yourself. "You look well," her father said, examining her face with the directness that had always been his primary mode of communication. "I am well," she said. "Better than well, I think." He glanced around the hall, not at the architecture she knew, but at the atmosphere. Reading the space the way she read ledgers, looking for what was underneath the surface. "This is a different house than you described in your first letters." "It is," she agreed. "Good." He patted her hands and released them. "Now, where is this husband of yours?" Thomas appeared at the study door. He and Robert Winthrop looked at each other across the hall for a moment. Emily watched both of them do it, watched her father take the full measure of Thomas Bradford with the quiet, thorough assessment of a man who reads people the way he reads texts, looking for the argument beneath the language. And she watched Thomas meet that assessment without flinching, without performing, without the managed confidence he had brought to every other first impression she had witnessed him make. He walked forward and extended his hand. "Mr. Winthrop," he said, "I owe you a considerable debt." Her father raised his eyebrows. "Do you?" "Your daughter saved this estate," Thomas said, "and everything I understand about why she is capable of that, I believe I owe to you." Robert Winthrop looked at his hand in Thomas's, then at his daughter, then back at Thomas. "Well," he said with the dry precision that Emily had inherited directly and completely, "that is a more accurate opening than I expected." He shook Thomas's hand. "Dang." The week of her father's visit was different from anything Bradford Hall had been before. It was not formal. Robert Winthrop had no patience for formality as an end in itself, only as a structure occasionally useful for getting things done. He ate at whatever table was convenient. He went to the library without asking. He found Thomas in the estate offices on the second day and sat with him for 3 hours, going through the new account structures with a curiosity that was entirely genuine, asking questions about the Bradford landholdings and their history and the nature of the soil and the tenancy arrangements with the focused interest of a man who finds everything interesting because he has decided that everything is. Thomas Emily discovered from Mrs. Higgins, who had been observing with the quiet thoroughness that characterized her knowledge of everything that happened in Bradford Hall, had not once in those 3 hours performed. He had simply talked about his father and the estate, and the mistakes he had made, and the ones he was trying not to make, and what the accounts looked like now versus what they had looked like 6 months ago. Her father said over breakfast on the 4th day, when Thomas had briefly gone to the stables. "Hi is genuinely changing." Emily looked up from her tea. "I know," she said. "I mean specifically." Her father set down his cup. "I have known men who make a show of changing because they understand it is required. The performance is recognizable. There is a quality of effort visible in it, a slight overcorrection, a watchfulness about how it is being received." He looked at his daughter. "That is not what he is doing. What he is doing is considerably rarer. He is changing because he has decided that who he was is not who he wants to be. The decision is internal. The change is therefore real." Emily was quiet. "He is still proud," her father continued. "He will always be proud. It is structural to him, not incidental. But pride without arrogance is not a flaw. It is simply a strong spine." "You've assessed him thoroughly," Emily said. "I've been assessing him since your 3rd letter," her father said without apology. "Which is my right as your father and my duty as someone who was paying attention when you were not paying attention to yourself." Emily looked at him. "What do you mean?" Her father picked up his cup. "I mean that in your 3rd letter, when you described your investigation of the accounts you wrote about this house, with the particular quality of language people use when they are attached to a place. And in your 6th letter, when you described the solicitor's first visit, you described Thomas Bradford's questions with the particular care of someone who is noticing a specific person." He met her eyes. "You were not aware of it. That is how I know it was real." The breakfast room was quiet. Emily set down her own cup. "You are a very perceptive man," she said, slightly more unguarded than she had intended. "You inherited it," her father said simply. Thomas found Emily in the East Library on the last evening of her father's visit. It was late. Her father had retired. The house had settled, and Emily was at her desk with the estate correspondence she had been managing, which was not the defensive accounting of a woman proving her usefulness, but the ordinary productive work of someone who had been running a complex household efficiently for 9 months and found it genuinely satisfying. Thomas came in and sat in the small chair, which had by now been informally redesignated as his chair by the simple fact of his repeated occupancy, and he sat in it differently than he had in the early weeks. Less careful, more settled. The way you sit in a place you have learned to feel at home in. "Your father told me something this afternoon," he said. Emily waited. "He told me that when you were 16, you found an error in your family's accounts that had been missed for 3 years. A supplier overcharging for materials. He said you identified it in an afternoon and presented the documentation to him the following morning." Thomas looked at her. "He said he looked at the documentation and told you it was the best analytical work he had ever seen, including his own." Emily was quiet for a moment. "He told you that?" "He did." Thomas held her gaze. "He also told me that he spent the next 10 years worrying about what the world would do with a woman of your particular capabilities. Whether it would recognize them or waste them or his word diminish them." He paused. "He said that when he received your letter describing the hearing and the outcome he wept. That it was the only time in his adult life he had wept from relief." The library was very quiet. Emily looked at the desk in front of her. At the correspondence, the organized files, the small leather journal she had carried from Yorkshire and filled with 9 months of observations and facts, and the occasional private truth she had allowed herself to write down in the small hours when accuracy required it. "He didn't tell me that," she said. Her voice was even, mostly even. "I think he found it easier to tell me," Thomas said gently, "because telling you would have required him to say aloud how frightened he was. And fathers, I suspect, prefer to be perceived as certain." Emily pressed her lips together once. "Yes," she said, "they do." "Emily." Thomas leaned forward. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it not as an apology, because I have given you the apology, and you received it, and we have both moved past it. I want you to hear it as the truth of what I know now." She looked at him. "Your father was afraid the world would diminish you," Thomas said. "I was the part of the world that tried. I stood in a room full of people on the night of my own wedding, and I looked at the most capable person I had ever encountered, and I told her publicly that she would never be my equal." He did not look away. "I have thought about that moment every day since I understood what I was looking at. Every single day. And what I know now, what I know absolutely, is that I was not her inferior. I was not her equal. I was not her superior. I was a man standing next to a woman who already knew who she was, and I was so frightened by the steadiness of that knowledge that I tried to dismantle it with a sentence." The room held. "It didn't work," Emily said, quietly. "No." A breath. "It didn't work. Because what I know about myself," she said, "was not given to me by any room or any man or any wedding. I came here with it. I carried it through everything that happened here, and I will carry it out the other side regardless of what is or is not decided between us." "I know that," Thomas said. "That is precisely what I am telling you, that I know that now, completely, without any of the qualifications I would have added 9 months ago." The candlelight was steady. Emily looked at him, this man who had become through the specific combination of crisis and choice, and the daily discipline of deciding to be honest, something she had not anticipated. Not perfect, not remade into some ideal, but real. Genuinely, usefully, durably real. "Ask me the question," she said. He was still for a moment. Then he said it. "Will you be my partner, Emily? Not my wife in the way I understood that word when we married. My partner. In this estate, in this work, in whatever comes next. With your name on the account structures, and your assessment sought before major decisions, and your opinion treated as what it is. Not an inconvenience, Not a domestic curiosity, but the clearest and most reliable thinking I have access to." He paused. "And with me beside you, trying imperfectly and honestly every day to be worthy of it." Emily was quiet for the length of 3 full breaths. She thought about her father's kitchen table. She thought about her mother's lace. She thought about 6 weeks in a cold library, and a candle burning to nothing, and a picture emerging from numbers, the way truth always emerged when you were patient enough to look for it. She thought about a wedding night, and a sentence that was meant to define her, and had instead revealed him. She thought about what it meant to be seen. Not displayed, not managed, not assigned. Seen with the specific attention of someone who has stopped being afraid of what they are looking at. "Yes," she said. One word. The exact weight of everything it contained. Thomas exhaled. And something in Bradford Hall shifted, not dramatically, not with the ceremony that the moment in a different kind of story might have required. It shifted the way real things shift quietly, permanently, with the simple inevitability of 2 people who have found through the specific difficulty of being honest with each other exactly where they stand. The months that followed were the months that built something, not without difficulty. Difficulty was the permanent condition of running a large estate in 1817, of navigating the social reconstruction that followed a very public fraud case of 2 strong-minded people learning day by day how to share decision-making without one of them disappearing into the other. There were evenings when Thomas's pride and Emily's precision collided over a contract interpretation, and neither of them backed down immediately, and the East Library got very quiet for a while before one of them found the thread of humor that had somewhere in the past year become one of the reliable textures of their private life together. There were mornings when Thomas came to Emily's desk with a problem he had been turning over alone for 3 days and sat in the small chair and laid it out and listened. Actually listened with the fullness of attention she had spent 9 months earning from him while she worked through it. There were evenings when she came to his study with something she hadn't entirely resolved and sat in the chair across from his desk and said simply, "I need to think out loud." And he set down his correspondence and said, "Go ahead." The workers at Bradford Estate noticed. It was Nell from the dairy who said it first to Mrs. Higgins, who passed it along with characteristic discretion to the household at large. "The mistress walks the estate like she owns it, and the master walks beside her like he knows the difference." Mrs. Higgins had said with the profound understatement of a woman who had seen everything that had happened in Bradford Hall from the kitchen table outward. Yes, he does know the difference now. In November, Emily's father returned for a longer stay. He arrived this time without apology for the books which Thomas had already arranged storage for in advance. At dinner on the second evening, Robert Winthrop watched his daughter and her husband conduct a disagreement about a tenant lease renewal calm, direct, each holding their position until the better argument won, which on that occasion was Thomas's, and said nothing until after dinner, when Thomas had gone to his correspondence, and Robert found Emily in the library. "He argues with you," her father observed. "Yes," Emily said. "He doesn't manage you when he disagrees. He engages." "Yes." Her father was quiet for a moment with the quality he had that meant something was settling into its final form. "That," he said, "is the rarest thing." Emily looked up from her books. "I know," she said. He patted her shoulder once with the precise affection of a man who expressed love primarily through accuracy and went to find his own reading. The dinner was held in December. Thomas had in fact organized it entirely himself, which was the first large social event at Bradford Hall that had not been managed primarily by Emily, and which Emily had watched develop with the specific interest of someone who wanted to see what he did with it when he had full authority. He had invited 40 guests. The list was different from any list Bradford Hall had previously assembled for a gathering of this size. It included the Hargreaves, who had cancelled in June, and who had sent an acceptance in November with a letter that made no direct reference to why they had originally cancelled, which Emily had chosen to interpret generously. It included Mrs. Alderton, of course, and Mr. Pierce, who came in his professional capacity as much as his personal one. It included 3 men who were tenants of Bradford Estate, not gentlemen, not members of the social class that had historically occupied Bradford Hall's dining room, but men whose work kept the estate functioning, and whom Thomas had decided without consulting anyone, belonged at this table, and it included traveling down from Leeds. For the occasion, a woman who had been introduced in the invitation simply as Mrs. C. Fielding, and who arrived in a dress that was modest and well-made, and who stood in the hall of Bradford Hall for a moment before Emily reached her, looking at the house with the expression of a woman who has spent 8 years carrying something and is only now in this specific room beginning to put it down. Emily took both her hands. "You came," Emily said. "You asked me to," Mrs. Fielding said. "I wasn't certain you would." "I wasn't certain either." Mrs. Fielding looked around the hall at the guests gathering at the candles at the sound of a house that was functioning as it should function. But it seemed important to see it, the end of it. "Yes," Emily said. "It is." At dinner, Thomas stood. The table went quiet with the specific quality that rooms go quiet when a man who commands attention has something to say that is not his usual kind of saying. He looked at the assembled guests, the county families, and the tenant farmers, and the solicitor, and the widow from Leeds, and he spoke without notes, which Emily had not known he would do, and without the performance she had watched him deploy in every other public speaking occasion she had witnessed. He spoke plainly. About Bradford Estate and what it had nearly become. About 4 years of fraud and how it had operated and why it had operated, because the man who owned the estate had trusted without looking and believed that his position made scrutiny unnecessary and dismissed the person best positioned to see what was happening because she was not the kind of person he had been taught to listen to. The room was very still. "I was wrong," Thomas said. "Not ceremonially. Factually. Not in the way men are wrong when they make an error of calculation. In the way men are wrong when they have decided in advance what something is worth and refuse to look at evidence to the contrary." He paused. "I told my wife on the night of our wedding that she would never be my equal. I said it publicly in this house to people I believed would find it amusing or appropriate or simply unremarkable." He looked at Emily across the table. "I have spent the past year understanding how much I did not know about what I was looking at. And what I know now, what I will carry from this year for the rest of my life, is that the woman I dismissed on that night was never beneath me." The room was absolutely silent. "She was never my inferior," Thomas continued. "She was never something to be managed or assigned or contained. She was the clearest thinker, the most rigorous mind, the steadiest person in this house from the first morning she walked into it. And I nearly lost everything I own because I was too proud to know it." He lifted his glass. "This estate stands because Emily Bradford chose to protect it," he said. "When it was not required of her, when she was not thanked for it, when the person who should have been standing beside her was standing in her way instead." He held the glass out toward her, not grandly, not performatively, with the simple directness of a man making the truest statement he knows how to make. "To my wife, who was never the person I thought she was. She was always considerably more." The room lifted their glasses. 40 people in the candlelit dining room of Bradford Hall in December of 1817 raised their glasses toward Emily Winthrop Bradford. Emily sat with her hands in her lap and her spine straight and her composure entirely intact, which was the composure she had brought into this house 11 months ago and which had survived everything that had been done to test it. She did not cry. She was not that kind of woman, but something in her eyes, in the specific quality of light in them, told Mrs. Alderton, who was watching from 3 seats down, that she was feeling the full weight of the moment and choosing to carry it without bending, which was, Mrs. Alderton thought, exactly what you would expect from Emily Bradford and exactly why it was so extraordinarily moving to witness. Mrs. Fielding, 2 seats further, set her glass down after the toast and looked at the tablecloth for a moment. Then she looked up, and the expression on her face was the one Emily had hoped for when she had written the letter of invitation. Not happiness, exactly because happiness was too light a word for what Mrs. Fielding carried, but the particular peace of a woman who has seen something finished that needed finishing, who has watched an accounting be made that she had stopped believing would ever come. Emily caught her eye across the table. Mrs. Fielding nodded once. Emily nodded back. After dinner, when the guests had moved to the drawing room, and the evening had taken on the warm, loosened quality of people who have eaten well and said true things and found the combination. Sustaining Thomas came to stand beside Emily near the east window. He stood beside her, not in front of her, not behind her, beside. "Well," he said quietly enough that only she could hear. "Well," she agreed. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the room, the tenants talking to the county families. Mrs. Fielding in conversation with Mrs. Alderton, Robert Winthrop. In the corner, engaged in what appeared from his expression to be a deeply satisfying argument with Mr. Pierce about something neither Thomas nor Emily could hear from across the room. "I meant it," Thomas said. "Everything I said at dinner." "I know you did," Emily said. "And the question I asked you in the library 3 weeks ago." "I remember." "And your answer." "I remember that too." He turned his head to look at her. She turned hers. They were standing close enough that it required very little distance to be covered before his hand found hers. Quietly at their sides, the way it had in the library. Not dramatic, not performed, just the simple physical fact of two people who have decided to stop maintaining the distance between them. "I told you I would never be your equal," he said, very quietly, for her alone. Emily looked at him. "Yes," she said. "You did. I was wrong about which direction the inequality ran." She looked at him for a long moment. This man, this Bradford Hall, this life that was becoming something she had not planned and had not needed permission for, and had built piece by careful piece from the ground up. "We'll work on it," she said. And the warmth that moved across his face at those words, quiet and real and entirely unperformed, was the answer she had been waiting 11 months to see. She did not look away from it. She held his hand in the candlelit room of Bradford Hall, surrounded by the evidence of everything she had built and everyone she had protected, and she thought that this specific earned, undeceived, fully honest life was exactly what she had always been worth. She had known it on her wedding night. She had known it in the cold library. She had known it in every room of this house where someone had tried to make her smaller than she was, and failed because you cannot diminish a woman who already knows the size of herself. Thomas Bradford had told her in front of everyone he knew that she would never be his equal. He had spent a year discovering what that sentence truly revealed, not about her, but about the distance he still had to travel to deserve standing beside her. He was traveling it, imperfectly and honestly and every day. And Emily Winthrop Bradford, who had never needed anyone's permission to know her own worth, had decided that was enough. Not because she had settled. Because she had looked with all the precision and clarity and unflinching accuracy she brought to everything, and she had seen something real. She had always been the most capable person in any room she entered. Now for the first time she was in a room where the man beside her knew it too, and that she had decided was not a small thing. That was everything.